yeah, it's got to be true, so I believe it to be true. That's just producing a fault line that is not only going to commit you to dishonesty in your historical work, and every book of apologetics shows that. Victor just gave these great examples. What more do you need, Craig? What more do you need, Gish or D'Souza? How many hundreds of times does this have to be disproven for you to stop using this? There's this great quote. Tillich says, fundamentalism has demonic aspects in that it splits the conscience of its thoughtful adherents and forces them to repress knowledge of which they are secretly aware. So why is the fundamentalist and the apologist on the warpath? Well, it's against himself. The unbeliever that he goes on crusade against is in his own mind. That's certainly my experience, and I believe it's not unusual.
And welcome back to the Gnostic Informant, and you are about to attain true gnosis. And I'm joined by Dr. Robert M. Price, who haven't had on in a long time, and I've had some Patreon members ask where you've been at. And I said, maybe if I have him back on, we can do some sort of challenge Dr. Robert Price session. And then I asked you about it, and you said, okay, let's do it. I said, all right, let's open up the floor. And there's already some super chats already. We didn't even start yet. I wanted to at least ask a question or two myself. But I will actually. I want to ask you somebody in the super chats already asked one of the questions I was going to ask you. I noticed that, so I'll just hold off on that one. But I want to ask you about honorary PhDs. I want to ask you about particularly the Ralph Ellis one. What was behind that? I'm just curious. It's no hard feelings. I just want to know.
Well, there were about 10 people that I awarded these to because their work seems to me, though they wind up in different places, to be so deeply researched and so ingenious in a discerning way, not just creative imagination, but new ways of construing old evidence. And Ralph is one of those. I don't necessarily, from what I know of many of his theories, I don't know enough about it to say they're wrong, though they sound very suspicious to me, but then I'm not in a position to judge. And I don't really care because I share with the postmodernists the idea that since you can't really know what is true, I don't agree with them saying there isn't any truth, but it's very difficult to know what the truth is. And so sometimes the best you can have is what they call a strong reading, one that is most productive of reactions and further research and so on. And Ralph, who is very erudite to a degree I envy, has come up. I don't know quite how he puts all these pieces together because I've only begun reading his material. But to me, there is no orthodoxy I need to enforce, much less a critical one. And I just find it fascinating to encounter drastically new perspectives. I've always felt that way reading Hugh Schoenfield and John Allegro. These guys are no doubt picking up things that I have never noticed because they're using different lenses. So I stand to learn something, even if I don't buy the whole thing. And I don't know if there's any single scholar who I simply, believe and obey any more than I encourage anyone to just become a Pricean. What a farce that would be. I only want to supply stimulation and information for people to use in creating their own synthesis. And so Ralph is, I've heard him described as a fraud. I don't see that as a relevant charge. You might say he's a crackpot if you so severely disagree with him. I would not use that term of him because it's just negative and is useless in evaluating what he says. But he is eccentric like I am. I mean, I know there people think I'm nuts for what I say. I don't care, and there's no orthodoxy in my mind. So I wanted to, since I knew no respectable, legitimate institution is going to give these people the recognition that I think they deserve. And I've been on official dissertation committees before at Drew University. And I think that these people, it's like Earl Doherty. People say, well, you know, he doesn't have a doctorate. I say, look, read his books. That's his doctorate. He published them. Well, so did David Hume. I just don't, that all is nonsense to me. So
I understand that.
You know, I'm interested in recognizing the erudition of these people, especially the ones that are beyond the pale, like I am. And I don't pretend that this gives anybody any accreditation. It's just a sign of respect and appreciation.
That was fair answer, I should say. But enough of me. There's a bunch of people already asking away, so I'm just gonna hold off. If we have time at the end, I can jump in. So let's let the people ask away. Ted Francis, thank you for the super chat. What does Robert M. Price think about there being an angel named Jesus in the writings of Philo or any Jewish tradition?
Yeah, that is very suggestive, especially since Philo has so many other things to say about the firstborn son of God, who is the Logos and the heavenly high priest, and all of this stuff. It sounds like you're reading Colossians or the Gospel of John. And who knows? I mean, maybe these things were simply in the air. There's certain like Middle Platonistic doctrines were popular. Who knows? But I wouldn't be surprised if if New Testament authors had read Philo. I think it's quite likely, and it sounds like New Testament Christology. And if there's an angel, a heavenly Jesus, then you really, I mean, even with the Old Testament patriarchs, he said things like Isaac was the Logos incarnate or in person. Now, he may have meant that as like an allegorical symbol, but then how do we know John didn't mean it that way in his gospel? So that's a very provocative fact that needs to be more deeply explored.
Yeah, and I would never say that it's impossible that there couldn't be this tradition, that this tradition couldn't exist, but when you say something, and this is actually, and this question's obviously getting at Carrier, Dr. Carrier, and you know he's said before in front of audiences at Skepticon or whatever the place was, that there's this is an undeniable fact that there was a Jewish tradition that believed in an angel named Jesus. That language right there, that is an undeniable fact. To me, that's just objectively incorrect. Now, if you said, you know, we don't have any evidence per se, like we don't have any fragments that say this. We don't have any, like, there's no Gnostic text. There's nothing in the Dead Sea Scrolls. We don't have any apocryphal texts that have this. But here's my inference based on this, and this, and based on this, and this. And I conclude that there might have been this tradition. Do that all day. In fact, that's what he does in his book, the book that got peer reviewed. He does do that. He was careful in that sense. But then to then take that carefulness and then go out in public and just start saying we proved it, it's all there. That's where that's my disagreement with that. But yeah, I think your answer made sense too. I think, yeah. Anything else you want to say about that?
Well, there were Jewish groups that believed in this or that Old Testament patriarch as having been virtually deified, and like Enoch. I mean, they have him being transfigured into a fiery giant angel with hundreds of wings and so on, and sitting in his own throne at the right hand of God and being given the designation the Lesser Yahweh. I mean, if you're going to say that, it's you're practically there with I mean, the enthroned Jesus might as well have started out as Joshua. or Joseph. I mean, there are great affinities there too, and he was pretty much deified, as you read in Joseph and Asenath. He's even called the Son of God, etc. And there were other ones. The Mandeans had Seth, Enosh, and others as deified angels. Jacob is depicted that way. Abraham, Moses, even. It's
Right.
It's not surprising. So what he's saying, that kind of thing is attested. I'm not sure, though it may be sheer accident, that there's not an explicit statement about Jesus in those terms. But it's almost 6 of one, half a dozen of the other. To say that this happened with Jesus, it looks very likely because there was such a tradition.
Yeah, well, that's the thing. I will never deny that Christianity isn't coming out of that sort of milieu of Judaism. Of course it does. Of course Philo is being heavily borrowed from by the early Christians. Of course that's the fact. But then it's not, that's one thing, but it's another thing to then say that this I'm trying to think how to say this. That so you get it's one thing to say that therefore that the theology of the Christians, like in John, for example, where Jesus is the Logos, and you see all this language that you see in someone like Philo. Sure, I see that too. Paul's epistles, the traits that he gives Jesus is very similar to the traits that Philo gives his Logos. Yeah, of course that's the case, but that doesn't mean that there couldn't have been a guy who got handed down those traits because that was already the milieu of Judaism.
Right.
So it's
the same thing happened with Hussein and Shiite Islam. One latter-day Shiite thinker said, Hussein, the son of Ali, whose martyrdom has a cult of its own, this guy was the Logos that sustains the universe. How do you get from him being a martyr to that? Right. Well, it's not too surprising that might have happened with a historical Jesus. Not at all.
Yeah, and that was my thing. It's like if we're gonna point to Philo and say, wow, his Logos is so much like Christianity, therefore Jesus couldn't have existed. But it's like, what's more likely that the tradition that we hypothesize of this angel named Jesus was crucified in outer space, well, we don't have a text that says that particular. Not saying that couldn't happen, but what's more likely, that the text that we all have, if we just take the text that we have and say that's all that exists, then what's likely is there's a guy from Nazareth, he gets killed, and then all of a sudden all this Logos stuff gets applied to him. Or what's less likely, I think, this is my personal opinion, what's less likely is these traditions that we don't know about, that we're hypothesizing about, like saying that there was an angel named Jesus in another text that we don't have. We're just adding stuff. We're adding more layers, and we're not. It's less. I think it's less likely. That's what I'm saying. That's my final word on it. But you can whatever you want to say.
The only thing that affects that is the idea that Jesus may have been myth all the way down is not so much that the myth is similar to that of the mythic heroes and the deified patriarchs and all that, but rather that the stuff you would expect to yield a coherent picture, an attestation of a historical Jesus, is highly suspect. The thing that really pushed me over the edge was reading a bunch of books where different scholars tried to trace down this and that gospel passage, not just sayings, but stories, to various Old Testament stories, some of them very, very convincingly, and almost all of them quite plausible. And I thought to myself, well, wait a minute, what's left over? I mean, even without all the specifics, just the broad outline of his life and death in the Gospels sounds so much like other characters that nobody thinks were historical. Asclepius, Hercules, so on and so on. There's so many of them, and there's really nothing left over. If there was a historical Jesus who had a favorite flavor of ice cream, or was left-handed, not right-handed, and had these opinions and not those, it's vanished. And it's not surprising it would be, because that's like, what was Jesus doing before he came on the scene with John the Baptist? Nothing? Well, apparently nothing worth remembering. So that might mean there was nothing to report because he didn't exist, or that the data is just understandably lost. So you can't be sure. But I like what Rabbi Neusner said: what we cannot show, we do not know. So you can't simply assume that a character that fits the mythic stereotype so completely, with nothing left over and no real links to secular history, was a historical person. He might have been, and I think if he did exist, you could make a real good case, like Robert Eisler and S.G.F. Brandon and Reimarus did, that Jesus was a failed messianic revolutionary. In fact, that is argued so well, that's kind of my backup theory. I'm almost evenly divided as to pure mythicism or Jesus as a revolutionist. Both make a lot of sense to me.
And the last thing I want to touch on before we get to the next one is, I love this. It is possible. We don't talk. It's almost like most people go from, and I guess today, not like in the past. In the past, there was a lot of different views on Jesus, from the Son being allegorized to all types of things. But now in 2022, 2023, you have basically Carrier's version, that there was a pre-existing angel who crucified, or he was a revolutionary man that was mythologized. But there's always the possibility that the story is just made up. Mm-hmm. And no one talks about that because it sounds like a conspiracy theory, which it is, but it's still possible.
Yeah, there are conspiracies. It's not like the very idea of a conspiracy is a fantasy. There are conspiracies.
Yeah, I'm just throwing that out there. I don't think that. I think that you would need evidence for that as well. Just like I always say, when you say that Jesus was crucified in outer space, show me the text. Doesn't it? Okay. So that's why I say, even if it was the case that they just made it up, what I'm looking for is like not necessarily a text that says they made up or we made up Jesus today, but more like somebody challenging, like another Jewish sect being like, those Christians, they made this, like something like that, which I guess is a lot to ask for. But I'm just saying that would be your slam dunk right there if you had that, you know.
Well, I think that in Justin's dialogue with Trypho, written in, I guess, the last quarter of the 2nd century CE, you pretty much do have that as a Jewish response. He says, you Christians have created your own Messiah. And I mentioned that to Bart Ehrman in our debate, and he just laughed it off and said, yeah, but later on, Trypho assumes Jesus did exist. Yeah, but it's for the sake of argument. He's saying even if there was such a character, he fails to fit the messianic type. But I think there's really no way around saying that his belief was that there wasn't any Jesus. And I think 2 Peter says the same thing. He's defending against those who say that the Christians were following cleverly devised myths. But no, we saw him and all that. To me, that seems pretty straightforward. You just made this up.
Now, I will say I get what you're saying, but those two particular texts I've looked at, and my takeaway is that, for one, with the Trypho thing, I think it looks like he's saying you created your own Messiah, as in your idea of the Messiah is not what we thought with the Messiah. The Messiah is just supposed to be some guy who's gonna like usher in the kingdom of. He's not supposed to be God himself. Like, I think that's what he was getting at, was like, you just made your own weird Messiah that nobody thought was ever going to happen. And then for the Peter thing, I think he's talking about cleverly devised myths, as in like completely mythologizing the real facts of Jesus. Maybe he's talking about some of the Gospels. Maybe, I don't know, but you could be right. I'm not saying that I'm saying that I'm not shutting you down saying you're wrong, I'm right. I could be wrong.
Who knows? Yeah,
right. Yeah.
It just seems to me that if that's what they meant, you would have expected Justin to have Trypho say, you predefined the job of the Messiah.
Fair
If your
enough.
Jesus did everything you say, that still is not what Scripture said the Messiah would be.
That's true.
So but there's no way to be sure. But also Revelation, the idea that it says at one point that people were redeemed by the Lamb before the foundation of the world. What does that mean? That implies before there was a planet Earth. So where would it have happened? In heaven. And what does John then see in chapter 4? A heavenly throne room with the Lamb who was slain, but still lives. And there he is, having died, showing the marks of being dead. And he's supposed to be Aries, the ram, really. That, it seems to me, that is very close to saying that Jesus' death was not a historical event, but was a sacrifice offered in heaven. But again, it certainly isn't explicit.
Yeah, and this is the last thing I'll say. I'm like giving points to the mythicists for this. But there also, and we don't talk about this as well, there also is the whole genre that was popping, that was huge in this time period, of fake epistles. Fake Platonic epistles that were written between one man to another. They were not real letters. They assumed a letter, but really it was like a philosophical message somewhere deep within it. And Paul's letters, how do you know they're not like that? How do you know they're legit? I've always thought about that. No one really talks about that. But this is a collective ancient Greek novel.
Oh yeah, great book.
And there's tons of examples of epistles that are not real, but they're like these like Platonic dialogues, basically. And how do you know Paul's epistles aren't something like that? I'm just saying. I'm looking at it at all angles here.
Yeah, in fact, I think Adolf Geismann long ago pointed out that letters in the ancient world were like you could fit them on a postcard. And we have many of these letters discovered in papyrus dump heaps in Egypt and so on. Whereas often philosophers, whatever, would write epistles, which were really treatises in a kind of a superficial letter form. Well, that's certainly what you have in Romans, Ephesians, Hebrews, things like that. They're long, or God Almighty, how about First Clement? 60 chapters of boredom. So what is that? And his name is not even on it. And yet everybody, oh yeah, First Clement, when did he live?
Yeah, no, that's a good point. And but like even though I just said all that, I do think the most likeliest, the simplest explanation, there was a guy, minimal stuff we know about him, the rest mythologized, and that's what happened. Like, to me, that just makes the most sense. It's the easiest.
Could be.
But it could, who knows? Like, anyone can be wrong or right here. So thank you for that super chat. Pastor Sir Spence, always love seeing you in the chat. What are your thoughts on Marcion and the 2nd century dualist Christianity of Asia Minor?
Well, it looks a bit nowadays like that Marcion was not the inventor of all of this stuff. People had thought for a long time that the apologists like Tertullian and Justin and others said that Marcion had cut the Gospel of Luke and the 10 Pauline epistles that he had, minus the pastorals. And though Tertullian already admitted that Marcionites said, no, you Catholics have added all this extra stuff to sanitize him and make him safe for Catholicism. Well, it kind of looks to many scholars like they were right, that the original, that Marcion's versions, which we can somewhat reconstruct by the opponent's criticism of them. Oh, why doesn't he have this passage? Why did he cut that one out? Well, because it didn't fit his beliefs. It becomes more and more obvious that that's not what happened, because the stuff that is still in Marcion's gospel could easily be quoted against him, which Tertullian did. This couldn't have been written by a guy who believed about Jesus what Marcion did. And there are, with more text critical sources, more manuscript evidence, it turns out that what were thought to be distinctive readings of this or that verse that Marcion must have changed, no, they were common in the tradition, which was very unstable in the 2nd century. So it looks like there were other collections of Pauline letters that Marcion wasn't necessarily even the first to do that, and that he may not have done any editing to it. So was he the first to create the idea of a New Testament? He might have been, but not necessarily. And dualism, again, apparently there were other people that thought that. I mean, just think how common it is today for people to say, well, yes, God is sort of a rough customer in the Old Testament, but he's a nice hippie in the New Testament. Love, love, love. They don't seem to realize what they're saying is, I'm a Marcionite. Like, how do you explain? I did a column about this once called God Cop, Bad Cop, where people basically are Marcionites. And you don't have any reason to do that unless you say what Marcion did, that there are two different gods. That's why their profiles are so different. And Jesus says here and there that no one knows the Father except for the Son. Or John says no one has ever seen God except the only begotten Son, and all that. What sense does either of those statements make if the Father of Jesus was the Old Testament creator and lawgiver? That there are signals in the actual New Testament scriptures and in other writings that people thought that, like Litwa has shown in a book called The Evil Creator, that before Marcion, that Egyptians knew about Judaism, obviously, and that they asked, well, who is this Yahweh, who they called Ayao in their language? Well, he looks kind of bad. And they decided the God of the Jews is an evil God. They didn't need to know about Marcion or Valentinus or anything. They were just saying what Dan Barker and Richard Dawkins say, that God is this distasteful, despicable character, though people worship him. And if you're saying that, you probably don't think that's the only God. And so the roots of a dualism go back before Marcion. So he wasn't an innovator necessarily, but he's certainly the one that made it into an almost universally prominent religion. They had to shut him down after a few centuries when his gospel had made it around the whole Mediterranean world. So he is a pivotal figure, though perhaps not, he didn't create it all ex nihilo.
Yeah. And I think I almost wonder if he's applying this like Epicurean philosophy to his theology, because he's got this, there's a text, I think it's either Irenaeus or Hippolytus is writing about Marcion. I can't remember which one. It's one of the heresiologists, and they're talking about how Marcion thinks that in the Garden of Eden, that God, because he didn't know where Adam was, therefore he was basically saying that God can't be omnipotent. And that reminds me of the Epicurus passage where he says, if God can't do everything, then he's not omnipotent, or why call him God at all? And it makes you wonder, is that what, I wonder if Marcion's applying this type of philosophy to his own reading of the text.
Well, one of the ancient heresiologists, it might have been Epiphanius of Salamis, but I'm forgetting. He said that Marcion basically got his whole thing from Epicurus.
There you go.
Because you needn't fear the gods. That nothing's going to happen to you by the wrath of the God Jesus brought. And like Jesus, Epicurus became venerated by his followers as a god. So there are commonalities, and he might have known about Epicurus. That was a very popular philosophy.
Wow, that makes me feel Like I was right.
Yeah, maybe I'll have to send you one of these diplomas.
Thank you. Thank you for that super chat. Max the Confessor was Tertullian. Thank you for the super chat. Was Tertullian influenced by the Stoics? He says the Logos doesn't have omni properties and that divinity is just a sort of element, and the persons of the Trinity are forms imposed on divine material.
Well, Tertullian believed in something like economic Trinitarianism, which you find in modalism and less articulated slightly earlier in Irenaeus, who said that that implied that God existed or God acted in three different forms or in certain roles. And when Tertullian, who was the first to speak of three personae of God, he apparently meant by personae the original meaning of theater masks. To symbolize the character you were playing, you held up a mask in front of your face, like the famous smiling and frowning masks for comedy and tragedy. Those were the personae, which kind of imply it's a superficial thing. And whereas once the three Cappadocians, Gregory, and Basil, in the 4th century, really started developing Trinitarianism, it was important to say that the threeness of God is interior to the Godhead somehow. It's not like Hinduism, where Brahman without qualities is experienced by us on a lower level of perception as three deities, Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva. That's not really Trinitarianism. It's more like modalism, also known as Sabellianism or divine monarchianism, which is big in the 2nd century. Well, so Tertullian and Irenaeus hadn't gotten that far with it. So I'm unfamiliar with the statement that God formed the persons of the Trinity out of some material, but that's just my ignorance. That would fit what I do know of him, that he wasn't quite there with an interiority of the Trinity.
Wow, that's fascinating history. Thank you for that super chat. Justina Carrion, thank you for the super chat. Thoughts on Roman Prov?
It makes sense to me. Though somebody recently commented, would Romans, based on what we know about them, really have felt the need to create as a kind of pacifying hoax a gentle pro-Roman Jewish Messiah? Knowing who they were, wouldn't they just have stomped on a fourth Jewish rebellion? Would they have really tried this mind game, or wouldn't they just said, okay, time to get out the hobnail boots again? So that's worth thinking about. But who knows? This, in my opinion, Roman provenance is just a step away from the Jesus as a revolutionary idea, especially as Brandon argued it, because Brandon said, okay, Jesus was a revolutionist, and it wasn't a frame-up when he was crucified as the man who would be king of the Jews. But once his bid to take over and start a messianic kingdom was crushed, the disciples, or the sect, let's say, decided they wanted to continue, because Jesus also had said wise things. It wasn't one or the other. And but they realized we'd better make it clear that we're no longer interested in replacing Rome. Let's be like the Pharisees and the Sadducees, who realized they were living in a real world ruled by Rome. Let's make what accommodations we have to get along. It worked for Jewish leaders for a long time. Let's try to do that so they'll not see the need to come down hard on us. And so to that end, they made Jesus look like a kind of pacifistic hippie, turn the other cheek, all that stuff. And that they said, oh, crucified as a rebel, yes, but it was a frame-up. They lied about him. It was really that sneak Barabbas. And you don't have to worry about us. Like Paul, he was dragged before the authorities, but slandered. He posed no threat. And even your Roman procurators admitted that. Even Pilate admitted it about Jesus. So you never had anything to worry about. Of course, that's revisionist history. They're whitewashing it. But at least they're saying from now on, you got nothing to worry about from us. And so Christianity was altered, and the blame originally due to the Romans for executing Jesus is now passed over to the Jews. Oh yeah, it's their fault. Rome, we know you got maneuvered into this. You wouldn't have done it had you not been lied to. It was those Jews. And that makes an awful lot of sense to me. And if you see what I mean, it's what the Roman provenance people say, that Rome created this pacifistic Messiah. Here, Brandon is saying, no, the Christians created him. It was the only way to keep a Jesus alive and to maintain the identity of their movement. I regard that as a little more probable, but it is so close to the Valiant and Fahey and at-will theory that, they're not even necessarily ultimately incompatible.
Yeah, my only issue with it, which is a big one actually, is the idea that like the Roman emperors like Vespasian were involved somehow, and they're the ones that are really being worshipped. That's where I get lost. Now, I don't have a problem with saying there might have been some Roman elites involved in like maybe they were in Alexandria, Egypt, involved in some of the texts, some of these epistles, some of these gospels, even maybe even Mark or something. I don't have a problem with that at all. I think maybe that's possible. I just don't see how it would be likely that. I'll give you my example for a second. So Vespasian, this is what you get from Valiant does think this, but he doesn't go as hard on the Vespasian thing as Atwill does. Atwill's like Vespasian is Jesus, basically, which I don't even know if Valiant goes that far. But anyway, regardless of the fact, if Vespasian really was the Jesus and he was the one behind all this, and during the Flavian era, Trajan and Nerva are part of that government. Trajan was consul in the 90s during Domitian and Titus, and I think Nerva was even was a consul even before that. And they're so high up in this. How did they not know this? How does it get lost? And then all of a sudden, a century later, no one knows anymore what happened. There's no, without a trace, no one even knows that Vespasian had anything to do with it. We have to sort of like do this like mystery detective work to find this out. You would think there would be some more traces to Vespasian, unless maybe they just really wanted to cover it all up. But I just find that hard to believe. Does that make sense?
Well, yes, but the fact that we have Roman nobles and their wives converting to Christianity, even Nero's wife Poppaea supposedly became a Jewish convert, and is it I forget, I'm tempted to think it's one of the emperor's wives had a chapel with statues of Abraham, Orpheus, Apollonius of Tyana, and Jesus in it. I'm guessing that in the syncretistic mix of the Hellenistic world, once the pacifistic, whitewashed Christianity did establish itself, nobody would feel it necessary to dig up the roots of it. It would have been established as a religion that was usually tolerated, and probably how many people know anything about the establishment of Christianity today? I mean, even we who study it so much have to weigh more and less plausible guesses. So that doesn't strike me as all that odd, especially since, to my astonishment, it was relatively recent that I realized Josephus was not the only one to christen Vespasian as the Messiah. I knew he did, but I thought it was just he was saving his skin by sucking up to him. But Yohanan ben Zakkai proclaimed him the Messiah, and Tacitus and Suetonius, or one of the other Romans.
He doesn't call him the Messiah, though. People do. He calls him a king, but that is pretty important. But I think we should I think we shouldn't just say Messiah.
Well, that's what I heard, but I'm not familiar enough with the text.
Yeah, I know exactly what someone probably told you, and they're referring to a Talmud text. Yohanan ben Zakkai sneaks out of Israel, and he says, "You are the king. You are the king." And he says, "It's been prophesied that the king will come out of the east." And he says, "You're in the east right now. You're coming out of the east, going back to Rome. It's you." So, but he doesn't say Messiah, but I will admit that can be taken as messianic language all day long. I'll bring that up. I've had that on my channel before when I talked to Valiant. I even say to Valiant, that's a really good point. That's not, we shouldn't just ignore that. Like, that's in the Talmud. We shouldn't just ignore that. So I get that point too. But I don't know. I'm not convinced. But I think I think it's an interesting thing. I got to get Valiant back on here and just pick his brain and, you know, throw his hypotheses at some of these barriers and see if they stand the test, because you know it's fun. I enjoy it, you know, even if I don't necessarily agree. I think it's interesting. Yeah, let's thank you for that super chat. Philip Demick, thank you for the super chat. Best version and origin of Brainiac, #anything.
Brainiac was originally supposed to be a genius from the planet Kolu in Superman comics, I guess back in the 50s and early 60s. And his hobby was miniaturizing and stealing whole cities from planets that he then destroyed. And he was about to do the same with Krypton, and did manage to shrink and steal Kandor, the bottle city, as it's called. And but somehow he was stopped. Well, Krypton did explode, but he didn't do it. But then a few years later, somebody pointed out to DC Comics that the term Brainiac was already copyrighted for a particular massive computer. And so they worked out this thing where they changed the origin, retconning, they call it, so that Brainiac himself was an android. He was a humanoid computer. And the planet he came from was like V'ger in Star Trek, living machines. So they changed him slightly, but he was not essentially different. Later on, they changed his form so that he, in the comics, was depicted as having a kind of a metal exoskeleton, looked like a sort of a robot with a skull design, and he flew around in this huge ship that looked like a skull with tentacles hanging from it. But again, the same basic bad guy. And then later they decided to go back to the green-skinned humanoid. But once in one of the several reboots, they made him into a huge centipede-like creature who collected all the cities and all that stuff. And now I think they're back to the humanoid version. They're always changing these things, but the first time they did, it was to avoid a lawsuit. But to me, the android robot and the green-skinned alien are close enough to be about the same thing, and I find that the most interesting version of Brainiac, who they never have in the Superman movies. He showed up in a TV series once, but
wow.
They had a real problem once in the Legion of Superheroes, because in the 30th century, one of the members was Brainiac 5, a descendant of this guy. But how could he be the descendant of a robot? And oh my!
Wow, that's interesting. Thank you for that super chat. Something switch up. Jesus saves. Interesting. Do you think Jesus Ben Damnius is the brother of James?
Yeah, I do. I have to admit, I think Carrier is right about
Oh,
that, and that it doesn't make sense if it's actually the New Testament Jesus and James. I'd go Richard Carrier one further. He says, "Who was called Christ" is an interpolation. I don't think you even need to say that, because the point is, who is the anointed high priest? Well, they were called Christ, as in the Dead Sea Scrolls. So I don't think there's even a problem.
Wouldn't every high priest that he talks about get called Christ then? Because they're all.
Yes, that's right, because they're all anointed like the kings were.
Well, that's what I'm saying. Why doesn't Josephus call them all Christ then? He only uses that one time.
I guess just to designate that Jesus, son of Damnius, was the rightful high priest, so that it would pass to his brother. But I don't know. I mean, it's not open and shut, but I have to say, given the context and the general story that's being told, I don't see how it fits into anything with Jesus and James the Just from what else we're told about him. Whereas it seems to me that it's, the New Testament James may have been confused or conflated with this character, but that's not even necessary. I could be wrong. Richard could be wrong, but I think he's got a good argument there, even better than he thinks.
I will say this though. I think the Flavian, the testimony in Flavianum, there's a good case to say that thing could be completely forged, just because it's so barely cited by anyone for the first couple centuries. No one talks about it, and all of a sudden it becomes a big deal after 325. And so you have to wonder what was, if there was something there, what was it, if anything? You know what I mean? So, and if there was something there, like, let's go with, like, Steve Mason, who's spent his entire career focusing on this text, when he thinks there was something skeleton text there, and that he thinks the Jesus Ben Damnius passage is referring to this particular passage. Yeah, I guess that's possible. And I don't even think the testimony in Flavianum's out of place. It's in the same passage that they're talking about Pontius Pilate. They're talking about Pontius Pilate killing other Jews anyway. It's the perfect place for, if they were going to forge it, it's going to go right there. Perfect spot. So the argument that's out of place, I don't like that. But with that being said, the whole point of me bringing that up is that without people citing this passage at all, and if that's the case, then I think you might have a better. I couldn't argue against this being about another Jesus. That's what I'm saying. So I would say, yeah, I'm not even opposed to that being a possibility. But thank you for that super chat. Jason Sobek, Lord of the Four Corners, at Gnostic Informer Q&A, isn't a better model for understanding the gospel narratives found in the Greek novel. The novels had a trial as their centerpiece, epiphanies, crucifixions, empty tombs, etc.
Yeah, that's what I've argued for several years now. I couldn't believe what I was reading when I read the book you just showed, Reardon's collected ancient Greek novels, because I didn't know what I'd find in there, though I did know from a source book of texts for the study of the Gospels by, I can't think of his name offhand, but where they quoted the discovery of the empty tomb of Callirhoe from Cariton's novel Kyrios and Callirhoe, that looks so much like the discovery of the empty tomb in John chapter 20. But I had no idea there were like 3 other versions of this in these novels that they're impossible to date one by one, but they were written for a period of several centuries, but they seem to really have flourished in the 2nd century CE. And you do have this skeletal outline again and again, where this noble woman dies, and her either husband or fiance is just heartbroken, and he visits the tomb to mourn, but finds the tomb open and the body gone, and even the funeral garments rolled up by themselves. And he says, the gods have taken her up because of her beauty, and they've stolen her from me. But then somebody says, no, I think it's more mundane. And they figure out that tomb robbers opened the tomb because those were rich aristocrats, and they figured there'd be all kinds of rich funerary tokens in there, cloth of gold, robes, stuff like that. And they said, it's closed, so the stuff must be in there with the body. Let's break in and take it. Well, they do. That's why they open the tomb, narrative motivation. And they find the woman beginning to wake up from the coma. And they said, oh, God, what are we going to do now? We can't just kill her. That we'd be in deeper trouble. I got it. Let's kidnap her, take her away and sell her as a slave someplace. Nobody will ever know what happened. So they do this. Well, once the husband or fiance realizes that's what happened, he manages to find out where they headed for, what ship they booked or something. And he's following around the Mediterranean, always getting there as she has left. And ultimately, she catches the eye of some pagan governor or king who decides, you got to be my bride. And she, abandoning hope of ever seeing her husband again, she goes along with it. But no sooner does she do so than the husband finally catches up. And the king says, you're not going to ruin this for me, buddy. Crucify him. And they either nail or tie the good guy to the cross, or they're about to. There's slight differences. And one way or another, he manages to escape the cross. And so eventually he catches up with her. Both have now concluded that their spouse or lover is long dead. But holy mackerel, there she is. There he is. And they say, I can't believe it's you. Are you sure you're not a ghost? No, it's really me. Does this ring a bell? I mean, even the motif of why is Joseph of Arimathea said to be a rich man? So that there'll be narrative motivation for tomb robbers to break in and steal the body, and which is sort of what Mary Magdalene thinks happened. Oh, where'd you move the body to? I mean, it's so similar. Is it just coincidence? Could be. Anything's possible, but I can't think so.
And Jason says the writer of Mark knows Keratin's Calero changed my mind.
Yeah, it's quite a shock. I remember reading this thinking, holy mackerel.
Wow. Interesting stuff. Interesting stuff. Love it. The next super chat is from Grays. And there's a mix up with the question. It's down a little bit. Let me see where I can find it. Grays. Where are you? There we go. Thank you for the super chat. Looks like my super chat went away, but it said, do you have any unique takes on the authorship of Daniel?
Well, I do think that it must have been written during the Hasmonean revolt against Antiochus Epiphanes and the Seleucid Empire, and that's what is being described as if by prediction in symbolic terms. But as for a nameable author in the 2nd century, I have no idea. I don't know if there's even a theory about it.
Yeah. And there's also, I have a unique take, actually, mine as well, since you asked. Is it Julius Africanus?
Yeah.
Julius Africanus says that the text in Daniel has Greek idioms that only make sense if you translate it. Well, he's comparing the Greek and the Hebrew, and he's saying the Greek has the idioms line up. Like, you can tell that it was translated from the Greek to the Hebrew. That's what he's saying. That was what he was arguing. So the argument is that this is a forgery, and it's a Hellenistic text. It's not a 5th century BCE Persian text. This is a forgery from the time of Alexander the Great, or maybe even after that, Maccabee period, maybe.
No question.
Like, you have Christians saying this, church fathers saying this. So, like,
amazing.
Yeah. So it's a good point, though. But yeah, thank you for that super chat. Mr. Monster. Good to see you, Mr. Monster. Thank you for the super chat. Crucified space Jesus? Maybe the Mormons are onto something with their, in conclusion, with you becoming a god and making a new planet.
Yeah, they, Battlestar Galactica was created by Mormons, and they have the gods living on the planet Kobol, which is taken from the Mormon cosmology, where it's Kolob, that the gods live on. And as Brigham Young said, I think this was his and not Joseph Smith's idea, that as man is, God once was. As God is, man will someday be. It's the Adam God doctrine, which is really fascinating, this cosmic evolution thing. And because nothing like that is said in the Book of Mormon, which is all just a kind of, it's fascinating and deadly dull at the same time somehow. Smith certainly was the author of it, educated or not, but he certainly knew his Bible. And I think he just was like the great fantasy writer Lord Dunsany, an Irish baron in the early 20th century, who wrote in this scripture-like poetic prose tales of Pagania and fantasy worlds and so on, with their own gods and sages and so on. And he just paced around the room and let her rip while his wife was struggling to keep up, taking dictation. Not a second draft, nothing. He just had the muse. And I feel sure Smith did too, because he was looking into that hat for hour upon hour, just spieling off these stories that obviously are mixes of bits of especially the Deuteronomic history and the Book of Acts. He's got Christianity already existing in the Western Hemisphere during the Old Testament period, because he took seriously the crazy view of some Christians have that, oh yeah, Abraham and all these guys, they knew about Jesus and the cross and all. Well, Smith actually rewrote the history that way. So it's brilliant stuff. And Smith actually did have an ear for what ancient biblical prose would sound like, though his isn't as good as the King James Version. If you compare what he does, as I've done, with many modern pseudo-scriptural novels, theirs don't sound anything like an ancient work, but the Book of Mormon does. It is chloroform in print, like Mark Twain said, but it's an amazing work of the imagination, and but it doesn't have the unique theology that comes in Smith's revelations in Doctrines and Covenants and the Pearl of Great Price. It's really interesting. It's Trinitarian, even though later on he moved away from that.
Wow. Thank you for that super chat. Now, Constellation Pegasus, I just noticed you dropped a $199.99. If this was a mistake, please email me and we can figure this out. I just don't want there. This is thank you. Even if you meant to do $19.99 and you made a mistake, thank you for that too. I'm just gonna read it right now and I'll go. I promise I'm not skipping anybody, but just because of the amount, I have to just jump on it. Thank you for this. I'm so happy for this. It's all Paul's opinion. I'm sorry, First Corinthians chapter 7, verses 10, 12, 25 through 40. It's all Paul's opinion. How can Paul say he thinks he has Jehovah's Spirit in verse 40? Did not Paul meet Jesus? Chapter 7 is not the word of God. It's all Paul's opinion. Verse 40 exposes the chapter, all of chapter 7. This is a scam.
Actually, that's a little too severe, because Paul, or whoever the writer is, does claim revelation occasionally. Like when at the end of chapter 14, he said, look, if anybody thinks he's a prophet and disagrees with me, let him keep in mind that what I am writing is a word of the Lord. So sometimes he does claim, I mean, like he says, it's common in the congregations to have a word of knowledge, a revelation, or a word of wisdom. He doesn't base all of his teachings on that, because he didn't just wing it. He had to feel something, that he was getting some sort of psychic revelation. And when he didn't, what was he going to do when people asked him for advice? He says, look, I don't have a word from the Lord from this, but I believe I am shown to be trustworthy as a representative of the Lord, and my opinion is this. Now, this is, he isn't exactly claiming it's the word of God. Here you have to bring in the distinction Thomas Aquinas drew between inspiration and revelation. He said that something like the Book of Revelation, obviously, would be a revelation. I saw this and I saw that, a seven-headed dragon. He's seeing things in his mind, at least. That's a revelation. Or the Spirit said to me in Jeremiah or something. But most of it isn't. It's the text that some writer, usually we don't even know who it would have been, was led or supervised by the Spirit so that it came out the way God wanted it. But he didn't think it was dictated like to a stenographer. He didn't think it all emerged from a trance. He said, no, they used non-inspired source material. Like, if you want to know more about this, you can read about it in the book of the kings of Israel and Judah, stuff like that. No, it's a way of, it has to do with editorial judgment and so forth. It doesn't mean the whole thing was revealed or dictated by God. And I think that's the difference that Paul is assuming in 1 Corinthians 7. He says, I got a word from God on this, but not on everything. And yet I think you'd be better off heeding my advice. And Aquinas would say, well, there's probably more to it than he thought. I think the Holy Spirit was guiding him in a way that he didn't understand. But it wasn't like Paul suddenly, he's in a trance, yes, automatic writing. That's an absurdity, and nobody claims that even in the Bible.
Well, that's a really interesting. I never even thought about that, but it is kind of. I do get what he's getting at. Paul, it's Paul's opinion, and not only this, on top of what you just said, the religion of Christianity is sort of Paulianity. It's Paul's, whoever wrote Paul's epistles, I should say, it's Paul's opinions, and it's not just what you get from, let's say, the circle of Jesus, but it's, Christianity is Paul's. Does that make sense?
Yeah, but he didn't make all the claims that Christians now make, and they don't necessarily, I mean, some fundamentalists will say, yeah, they were just doing automatic writing like a medium, but many don't say that. They say, no, he had trustworthy wisdom from God, but that's not the same thing as a revelation, a bolt from the blue, which he and others occasionally experienced. But it doesn't need to be, because that's revelation. But inspiration means the rest of it is reliable. How do we know that? Well, we don't. It's by faith. Jesus and Paul, or whoever wrote 1 Timothy, they say they regard the Bible of their day, the Old Testament, as inspired. But they don't say those writers were aware of, whoa, what is this? So we have to draw distinctions, or we're going to wind up just making, sometimes it's ridiculous, but there's no point in making it more ridiculous than it is.
That's a great point. And you get Paul saying stuff like, when you're dead, what's going to be like the snap of your fingers in an instant, we're going to be teleported into heaven. Who told you this? Was this a revelation from Jesus, or was this some Pharisaic teaching?
Especially good example, because he says, this we say by the word of the Lord. Well, I always thought he meant that he or someone had a prophecy to that effect. But then I read an interesting book about New Testament eschatology, which says, look at what he says is going to happen. He's talking about the Old Testament. And he produced like selected passages from long sections of Isaiah, and all that stuff is in there. It's just that there's a lot of ellipses. So I think there he's just quoting the Bible.
Wow, interesting. Good points. Good points. Thank you for that super chat, by the way. Really appreciate it. Like, I don't know what else to say, but consolation package. Every time I see you in the chat, I'm always like, yes, we're gonna have a good stream. Thank you, Stefanos, with the $20. Thank you, Dr. Price. Who were the first people to quote the Gospel of Mark, Luke, Matthew, and John? What year were they writing? Thanks. Interesting. Never thought about that.
Well, this is funny because like probably the earliest known reference to them is something Papias, the Bishop of Hierapolis, about the mid-2nd century, said when he talked about Matthew and Mark, something by Matthew and Mark, which traditionally people have taken to refer to the Gospels of Matthew and Mark. But D.F. Strauss long ago pointed out that what he says in his description doesn't really sound much like our Gospels of Matthew and Mark. And we do know there were other writings ascribed to Matthew, at least. And so are they references to our thing? We don't have, I think the earliest quotes from the Gospels that are at all datable are in Justin Martyr around 170 AD or CE. And they are in a weird hybridized version, like Q sounding material. Oddly enough, again and again, it's like half of it is Matthew's version and half is Luke's. So what is he quoting? Is he quoting something like the Diatessaron, a kind of mixture of the Gospels together? That would be interesting if he is, but nobody mentions any stories from the Gospels until a long time later. So what is Justin quoting? Is he quoting some version of our Gospels or oral tradition that wound up in different forms in our Gospels? Walter Schmidholz, one of Bultmann's most radical disciples, speaks of the almost apocryphal status of the Gospels before the late 2nd century. And just recently I read, I think it was Marcus Vincent, I'm not sure, saying that even when you have what might be a quoted saying from the Gospels in some church father, why are there no quotes of gospel episodes? It makes you wonder if they didn't just have something like Q, like a book of Proverbs of Jesus. Why did they not have this? Did they not think it important? It's like the problem of why doesn't Paul ever say, I'm quoting Jesus of Nazareth, and he did miracles like this and that, you know. There's none of that stuff. Why isn't there? Well, maybe it didn't exist yet. And so that's the problem here too. So there are sayings quoted at least by about 170, but we're not sure where they come from, because naturally, you know, the theory is that various things were eventually assembled into the finished Gospels.
Yeah, I think you made a good point about Papias being early on, 2nd century, pretty clear. Yeah, thank you for that. That's a good question too. I never thought about that. Gray's 174 is back with another one. Thank you for the super chat. How upset would you be if Calvinism is true? And before you answer that, then if you were upset, that means it was planned that you would get upset.
Mm-hmm. When it's least expected, you're elected, you're the star today. Now you're on Calvinist camera.
For anyone who doesn't know, Calvinism is predetermination. Everything is pre-planned from the start. It's basically like deistic in a way. We're just playing the tape of God's favorite record or something. Like, that's all it is.
Plus, it seems to me to be classically Gnostic because of the limited atonement idea. Christ comes into the world to gather his predestined flock. And if you're not in it, you can't join it. No one comes to the Father. No one comes to me unless the Father who sent me draws him. It's not consistently Calvinistic, but that sure sounds Calvinist. And I think Bultmann was probably right when he speaks of John as having a dualism of decision, that this is really a kind of rhetorical strategy to say, do you wish you could be in the flock? Well, you can actually. How do you know if you are or not? It's really up to you to decide. To decide you're in the flock is to discern you're in the flock. It's like, and I think the idea of the parable of the soils in Mark 4 is that way. You know, these things could happen, and they do happen to people that hear the word but don't really follow through with it. So be careful how you hear. Well, that sounds at first like it's only a quarter of people at the most who are not damned. Well, how do I know I'm not in one of the three bad categories? Well, that's for you to decide. It's like Scrooge says to the ghost of Christmas yet to come, why show me these things if I am past all hope? So it has to be a way of shaking you by the lapels and saying, it's time for you to decide. And that's what Bultmann was all about, the eternal now, the encounter with God through the preaching of the gospel. Well, in its standard form, I think Calvinism is really self-subverting, because it implies that we are like characters in someone's novel, but the characters never know that they are characters in a novel. Right. All integrity of the narrative would be destroyed if suddenly, hey, you really want to have me do this? Give me a break. That would never happen. And so for God to predetermine it implies an unbroken series of divine causality that you could never know about, even if it were true.
It's so weird because it defeats the purpose of Christianity of having, like, the whole point is to have faith, right? Is to believe in the resurrection and you're saved. But if it's all planned out, then what's the point of believing if either God's gonna make you believe or he's not? So it's like, what's the point of even going out and preaching the word or trying to convert people? They're either gonna come to you predestinately or they don't. And I know a lot of Calvinists, like Derek used to be a Calvinist. He would say, "Oh, I would go out anyway because I was predestined to be the guy, to be the instrument, to get the guy who's predestined to come to me." And it's just like, it hurts your head after a while.
Yeah, it does. But that's right. I mean, that's somewhat consistent. But then you have to say, well, suppose I became a missionary and preached the gospel to penguins in Antarctica. But I decide, nah, I'm not going to do it. Did God predestine my shirking of evangelistic responsibility? Then why am I culpable for it? It really is migraine engendering.
Yeah, it really is.
Oh, and you can tell this is all a big mistake because of something Calvin didn't seem to notice. He said, the doctrine of predestination is such a cause of comfort for the believer, because you can say, I don't have to worry. Am I being good enough? Like Martin Luther was neurotic about. It's not a question of you being good enough. It's a question of you accepting the gospel of God's grace. But come to think of it, it's unconditional election. So how do I know I'm one of the elect? If I did, that would be comforting. But so the Puritans were racked with neurosis saying, how do I know? And that's why the Calvinist movement brought forth capitalism, right? That you figure, well, like Job, if I'm one of God's favorites, surely he would want me to succeed in business. Are you insane? I just read the Gospels. That's ridiculous. But nonetheless, they were sort of forced to it because they said, I may wind up in hell praising God. I think that you have to take heed of the greatest theologian, Bugs Bunny, who said, if you come up with that, you made a wrong point in Albuquerque. Somehow you got to go back to the drawing board if that's where you're ending up.
Wow, that's very fascinating. Constellation Pegasus with another one. Psalm 84:11. JW Bible says Jehovah is a son, not son. Wow, I did not know that. The Tanakh says son also. Is Jehovah? Oh, okay. Is the Old Testament here? Is Jehovah Hashem, El, or whatever an influence of ancient Canaan and Israel religion from the Egyptian sun god Ra?
Probably so, because I think it's Psalm 104 that seems to be based on or even borrowed from Akhenaten's hymn to the sun. And it uses overt solar imagery, that God is gives the law and all of that stuff, just like Apollo gave the law, and he was the sun god, or Moses with a shining face as he leaves the tent of meeting brings commandments. Just as Psalm 104, the sun is like a vigorous man emerging from his tent, etc. And it's all tied in. Moses, the sun, the Torah. And in those passages, it does say Yahweh our God is a sun and shield. I think I read that there's an alternate possible translation, but that does make sense because there are other references, solar references to God, as if you needed one beyond Psalm 104. So solar imagery, I mean, certain Bible characters simply were the sun, like Samson, Elijah, Moses, Esau, and Enoch. I mean, they're laden with solar imagery. That's one place where the astrotheology people are exactly correct. A lot of these characters began, or Abraham, he was the moon, the father of the multitude of stars, etc., etc. So it's not too surprising that sometimes God is a solar deity as well.
Wow, thank you for that. That's a really good point. I never thought about that, but that's probably the case. I mean, the sun is where we get our. You see the sun come out, springtime, life comes out of the ground. So it's only natural to think that the ancients would identify the sun as some sort of power of God, or at least a messenger of God, if not that. But yeah, good point, Constellation Pegasus. Thank you for that super chat. Appreciate it. Let's get to the next one. It's Halia Emerson. Thank you for the super chat. Do you see any cynic philosophy similarities between Diogenes and Jesus?
Oh, yeah, loads of them. One scholarly trend, I don't want to say fad because that implies it's not to be taken seriously. One interpretation of the historical Jesus that was real big about 10 years ago and may still be, I'm not sure, is that Jesus was a cynic or cynic-like sage, because we know that there were notable cynics like, what's the name? I can't believe I'm forgetting this. But there were two.
Zeno?
No, he was the founder of the Stoics, so he did have similar views. The Stoics mutated from the Cynics, but Demonax, I think he lived in the Decapolis, a bunch of Greek cities on the other side of the Sea of Galilee. But there were a few of them who, within a century or so, were known to have been itinerant teachers of cynicism. Cynicism was named either for the porch where they used to meet with Diogenes, which was called the Kynosarges, or they were named for Kunos, dog, because Diogenes said that his model for life was that of the roaming dog, because the dog had enough to eat and didn't care what you thought of him, and neither does he. And the Cynic motto was, we should live in accordance with nature by reason. And if we do that, we will see that we have lost all simplicity in life. If we want to see what that would be like, look at the flowers of the field, how they don't toil or spin. Yet Solomon, in all of his grandeur, he didn't look, he was wearing a potato sack compared to them. The birds, they don't have jobs. Don't you think that in the sight of God, you're worth more than a lousy bird? So don't worry. Where's your next meal coming from? Where are you going to get your next suit of clothes? Look, you get busy preaching the kingdom of God, and God will see to your provision. And through the people you preach to. Don't worry, he'll have generous people give you shelter and all that. When he sends out the disciples, he says, don't carry any money, any extra provisions, not an extra shirt, no shoes, or they change it in different versions of it, but it's always like almost nothing. Why? Well, you got to have faith in God. And they knew that the Cynic philosophers were accoutred pretty much like this, and that's why there are minor differences, so you're not confused with them. Well, the Cynics preached renunciation of all possessions and money. Who do we know who did that? They said you shouldn't have a job, you shouldn't have a family, leave your family, just like Jesus says in more than one place. You should be shameless. Feel free to ridicule venerable religious practices and defy expectations. Somebody saw Diogenes coming out of a whorehouse one morning, and they said, "What are you doing there? That's no place for a man like you." And he says, "Look, when a ray of the sun penetrates an outhouse, does that defile the sun?" Well, same here. It's just like why does he eat with tax collectors and sinners? Or Jesus says, you follow me and let the dead bury their own dead. Well, somebody asked Diogenes, I hate to say it, but you looking kind of bad and you're very old. Have you thought about funeral arrangements? He said, nah, I'm pretty sure the stench will get me buried. He didn't care. Somebody saw him pretending to beg money from a statue. They said, what are you doing? And he says, oh, I'm practicing getting refused.
Yeah.
He was like this cynical, sarcastic wit. Or how about the time Alexander the Great heard about him and made a side trip to see him, and there was Diogenes lying on the grass at the top of a hill, and Alexander says, I've heard so much about you. I really admire you. Ask me for any favor and I'll grant it. What would you have? And Diogenes said, well, if you really want to know, step aside, you're blocking my sunlight. And Alexander said, if I weren't Alexander, I would be Diogenes. And there's loads of anecdotes and sayings attributed to him and other cynics. Where do you find stuff like that in the Gospels? Granted, there's the thing with the lilies of the field and all that, but do you ever hear of any rabbis saying, divest yourself of all your property, get rid of your family? No, that's not part of Judaism. It's only part of cynicism. And it kind of looks like that underlies a lot of the Gospels, that maybe because Jesus was like a cynic, or that cynics joined his movement, like the one Lucian talks about in his book about Peregrinus, who was a cynic and a Christian later, and then went back to being a cynic because there wasn't much difference between them. So, yeah, there is a load of at least similarities to cynicism in the Gospels. In the Pauline epistles, you have a huge amount of Stoicism. But again, Stoicism mutated from cynicism. They said, look, nothing is important but virtue, and living according to nature by reason. But that doesn't mean you have to be neurotic and be so afraid of possessions that you have to be rid of them now. That's giving them too much importance. Your attitude should be, if it turns out one day I got to get rid of these things, I'll be happy to do it. But why spurn them when it hasn't come to that? So you have a lot of that stuff in Paul. Yeah. No matter what situation I'm in, I've learned to bear with it and prosper. Boy, that's stoicism.
I got one more Diogenes story to tell, and it's about the dead burying the dead thing. Because you're right. You nailed it on the head. The dead burying the dead thing is definitely cynic. Well, not only does he say to, there's another story. It might be alternatives the one you just said. I'm not sure, but the story was they were asking Diogenes, who's late in his life, what do they want to do for his funeral arrangements? Like, what do you want to do? You're about to die. What do you want to do? What do you want? How do you want us to bury you? And what do you want? Do you want to just to burn you? Do you want to do? What do you want to do with your ashes? And he said, this is what he says. This is just straight up savage cynicism right here, like gangster mode. This is what he says. He goes, here's what I want you to do. I want you to tie a sword to my hand and throw me over the bridge into the river so that when I fall into the water, I can fight the fishes.
Yeah.
And they said, well, master, how would you know if you're going to fight the fishes if you're dead? He says, exactly. Why would I care what happens to my body if I'm dead? I'm just like, oh my God.
I love this guy.
Oh, and one more savage story before we go to the next super chat. So Alexander the Great, as you see on the screen.
Yeah.
He walks up to him, and the story you said is just the greatest with the sunlight thing. But there's another one, too. The other one is that the next day, Alexander came back out to say goodbye to him because he was going to leave Athens. And he went over to say goodbye to Diogenes. Diogenes was picking through a garbage pail, and there's bones in there. And he's like sifting through the bones. And Alexander goes, what are you doing? Why are you sifting through those bones? And he says, I was looking for the bones of your father, Philip, the king of Macedon, but I couldn't distinguish them from the bones of slaves.
Ooh.
And I'm just like, dude, this is a savage philosopher right here. He doesn't even care. He'll look the king right in the face and say, you're no better than a slave. I don't know. I think everyone needs to have a little bit of a cynic in them to live this life that we're in. It's great stuff. It really is good stuff. But as I fix my camera, I'm going to read the next super chat out. It's from Grays 174. In the Q&A of your William Lane Craig debate, someone asked, what if you're wrong? You said, a God that's going to fry me isn't worthy of worship, so I'm not worried. Why be unworried about a God? What would do about a God that would do that to you? Sorry, I couldn't read right.
Well, I guess what I'm taking for granted there is that this couldn't be the God that Christianity at its best talks about if God is just. Like Thomas Henry Huxley, who coined the term agnostic, he said that if you're intellectually honest about these things, you have nothing to fear from the afterlife. And it seems to me that's a way of saying, are we to believe in a God who is the Lord of truth and who seeks honest people? Speaking of Diogenes, who was always on the lookout for a single honest man, is God not the champion of honesty? Isn't that what he wants from us? And yet you say that he holds us responsible for beliefs for which there is not adequate evidence. How can he do that? How is that fair? Shall not the judge of all the earth be just, as Abraham said? It's that kind of thing that makes it impossible for me to take those threats seriously. They're making God into the devil.
Wow. Very, very interesting stuff. Thank you for that super chat. Grace 174. Appreciate it. The next one's from Grace 174 again. Thoughts on what Kanye's been up to?
I don't really know what he has been up to. I hear that he made some sort of anti-Semitic remarks, which, if so, if he wasn't misunderstood, then that is disgusting to me. But I don't know what he's supposed to have said. So I
He said, "You want to know what he said? I love Hitler." And then Alex Jones says, "You're joking, obviously, right?" And he said, "No. I love Hitler. I think he had some great ideas." And even Alex Jones, who's Alex Jones is, even
yeah.
Alex Jones was like, so who knows what's going on with Kanye? I don't know if he's having a mental breakdown. I don't know. No one knows. It's just
That does imply he's off his rocker, but who knows? I mean, you remember when Farrakhan said that Hitler was wickedly great? Well, I can see that as not being pro-Nazi. I mean, he was a great figure of history. Genghis Khan was. If that's what he meant, well, who cares?
Right.
But I don't know if that's what Kanye meant or not. I have no idea. It sounds wacky to me, and I think it's foolish to say such a thing,
right.
with or without explanation.
Yeah, he's just, I don't know. That's pretty much all I can say about that. Yaku, why secret? Thank you for super chat. Why secretly worship Vespasian if they already did? And then right underneath you says cult of Caesar.
Well, the question would be, since Jews and Christians notoriously did not worship the Caesars and would not throw the pinch of incense into the altar fire to sacrificing it to the divine spirit of the Caesar, this was a way of, if you accept, especially Joe Atwill's view, it's a way of tricking them into it by masquerading the Caesar as the Jewish Messiah. That goes a bit far for me. I think it's unnecessary even to his own theory, and it just seems pointless and implausible.
Yeah, I agree with that 100%. Thank you for the super chat. It's a good point. Good point. There is that cult of Caesar out. Rex Profanus, thank you for the super chat. Is it true Vespasian was referred to as Flavius Masia?
Well, apparently that's what Josephus said. And as I say, I've heard that Yohanan ben Zakkai did it. Now, were they just chickening out and butt kissing to save their skin? Who knows? I don't assume so, though, because after all, in the beginning of 2nd Isaiah, as we divide it up, which the occasion for which is Cyrus, the Persian emperor, allowing any Jews in Babylon who wanted to go back to their ancestral homeland in Palestine. Well, they got along well with them, and that's why Judaism really absorbed a whole lot of Zoroastrian doctrine. And the 2nd Isaiah, whoever he was, has God speak of Cyrus as my Messiah, my anointed. And because they viewed him as the hand of God redeeming them. And apparently they figured, well, who says he has to be a Jew? Also, according to a great book on Islamic origins called Hagarism by Patricia Crone and Michael Cook, they show that there is evidence to say that originally the Muslims were called Hagarenes, which referred in the first instance to the Hijra, or the Hejira in Latin, which originally referred to a march across the northern Arabian Peninsula to liberate, by Arabs and by Jewish allies, to liberate Jerusalem from the Byzantine Empire. And the guy at the head of this crusade was Umar al-Faruq, Umar the Redeemer, and that Muhammad was a kind of a prophet proclaiming him and preparing his way. But in one of several later reboots of early Islam, they shuffled it around so that Muhammad was the great prophet and leader and conqueror of Jerusalem, and Umar was one of his lieutenants who became, I believe, the third caliph afterward. So it's all murky, but nonetheless, that implies that it's another instance of Jews saying, son of a gun, suppose God's Messiah, who acts in our interest, is not one of us. What the heck? If they're Arabs, they're Ishmaelites, they're kinsmen anyway. And so the thing in 2nd Isaiah is even further away from that. But it's pretty clear they thought this Gentile was the Messiah. And if that's what the Romans were saying, and Jews accepted it, you know, this thing where we say that Josephus was a no good traitor. Yeah, that may be so. But on the other hand, I've always wondered, is he any more of a traitor than Jeremiah? Right? Jeremiah is depicted as being persecuted as a traitor because he said, look, you might as well give up now because God has summoned the Babylonians to kick your butts because you haven't lived up to your side of the covenant. And so what? He's going to destroy Jerusalem. Man, throw this guy down a well. Was Jeremiah a quizzling and a traitor? No. He said, I'm afraid God is no longer on our side because we aren't on his. Well, who's to say Josephus didn't see himself in the same position? He said, look, we're getting our butts kicked royally by the Romans. Are they able to defy the will of God? No. If the Bible tells us anything, it means that Rome is the hand of God in this situation. I mean, the Assyrians were no angels either, but we ought to get with the program. And so if that is the case, he would have been sincere in saying, Vespasian, you're the one predicted in the book of Numbers. And so it makes sense to me that way.
Interesting. The next follow-up from Rex Profanus is, can you talk about the floor of Flavian heaven?
I don't know anything about that.
I was hoping you knew because I never heard of Flavian heaven before. But Rex Profanus, I will look into that. It's something
fascinating.
Drop a link if you can. I'll check it out. Sounds interesting. I'll definitely check it out. And there's a third one from Rex. Thank you, Rex, for the super chats. Appreciate this. Speak on the relationship between the Vespasian and the Ebionites.
I plead ignorance. That's fascinating, but I've never heard of that either.
Yeah, I've never, and you know, I'm not the expert. I'm just a guy that likes to read this stuff and talk to scholars. I've as far as I'm aware of, I never heard of the Ebionites having a relationship with Vespasian. It could be true. And
yeah.
If it is, that might give some favor to the Roman Province people for sure. If that's the case,
fascinating.
Thank you, Rex. Appreciate it. Benevenstankiano. I think I said that right. Hopefully I did. Thank you for that super chat. I like the Simpsons logo. What is your favorite fictional take on the Jesus character? Have you read The Gospel According to Jesus Christ by Jose Saramago?
No, I think somebody gave me a copy of that. I've not yet read it, but of the ones I have read, certainly it would be Nikos Kazantzakis' The Last Temptation of Christ. The movie is fantastic, and the book is even better, which is pretty tough to do. And I've always maintained that it's the most orthodox theologically of any Jesus film. And this despite the fact that it scandalized conservative Christians, partly because certain things weren't explained, like they thought, wait a minute, Jesus is sleeping with Mary and Martha. Well, actually, according to rabbinic law, it was still possible to have more than one wife. So it's not like he was just, free love hippie or something. But they don't really explain that in the movie. But the most amazing thing about it is it's been a stumbling block to try to explain how Jesus could be a genuine human being and yet hold the conviction that he was God Almighty. Could a sane man believe that and not go nuts? Well, this movie and book depict that plausibly, that Jesus, as it begins to dawn on him, that there's something strange going on here, is whipping himself and trying to drive the devil out of himself, because he says that the voice inside is saying, "You're the Son of God," or "You are God." That's got to be blasphemy. Well, it takes him a long time to realize, no, this is God speaking to me and in me. It's plausible. They actually made that theologically and psychologically believable. What an amazing work. That has true theological significance.
Wow, interesting stuff. Thank you for that super chat. Renzo Rodriguez. Did Mark use Marcion's gospel or vice versa?
What's his name? Matthias Klinghoffer, I think, in a recent book, says that he thinks Marcion used a kind of proto-Mark, an earlier version of our Gospel of Mark. Most scholars think that Marcion used an earlier, shorter version of Luke. Ultimately, the two might meet in the middle, since you could say that Mark is a kind of proto-Luke, because it's added a bunch of stuff to Mark. But Mark certainly, and canonical Mark, has some pretty obvious anti-Marcionite material, trying to say, oh, no, he's got Jesus all wrong. Whereas the Gospel of Mark is merciless in its attack on the 12. One of them denies that he even knows Jesus to save his skin. Another one sells out Jesus for a few extra bucks. And all the rest of them are always making stupid remarks. And Jesus has to roll his eyes and say, no, here's what's true. Who in the early church do we know of who savaged the 12 disciples and seemed to like somebody else better, like in the famous strange exorcist passage? Master, you'll be happy to hear that today we saw a guy exorcising demons using your name to cast them out. And of course, we told him to cease and desist because he's working our side of the street. And Jesus, you did what? This guy's doing miracles in my name, and you think he's an enemy? We can use all the friends we can get. And who is this supposed to be? It's got to be Paul. He wasn't with the 12, but Jesus likes him anyway. So yeah, it fits so well that Mark, I mean, it's even the same name, right? Marcion just means little Mark.
Wow.
So
could be the case. It's a very good point. I love that question. Thank you for the super chat. And there's a couple more. And thank you. Blake. Thank you, Blake, for the super chat. What do you think blasphemy against the Holy Spirit means? Is it a one-time sin? Pastors have told me it really means rejecting Christ and you die in your sin. Yeah,
I just think that's as much of a gross reinterpretation as when Calvinists say, for God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believeth in him should not perish but have eternal life. Of course, world only means the predestined elect. What? Come on. Don't you know what words mean? The world, everybody, right? This is a similar kind of redefinition to fit better with your theology. The thing is, what's happened here is Jesus is just condemning blasphemy against God, and he's contrasting it with bad-mouthing or blaspheming or slandering a human being. And he says that in one version of this, I think the Q version, he says, all sins and blasphemies will be forgiven the sons of men, but blasphemy against the Holy Spirit is an eternal sin and can never be forgiven. In, I think, Mark's version, Son of Man has changed position. And whoever blasphemes against, whoever blasphemes the Holy Spirit is guilty of an eternal sin. and has no forgiveness in this age or the age to come. But he who blasphemes the Son of Man is guilty of any can be forgiven. I forget exactly the wording. I'm getting tired. But the thing is, in the original, he must have said, you can insult and blaspheme your fellow humans, and you can be forgiven for that. But if you go blaspheming against God, cursing God, saying that God is evil or something like that, you better watch your behind, because that can never be forgiven. It's the Son of Man, human beings, versus the Holy Spirit, meaning the divine spirit, because the issue here is blasphemy. How you better be careful how you speak about God. And so, when it says, hallowed be thy name, well, that's what Jews did by refusing to say Yahweh and saying Adonai when they came across the name of God, Yahweh, in Scripture. If they were reading it, they would say Adonai instead, because that was for some reason not as sacred, and because they didn't want to take it in vain and they weren't sure what that would mean. So let's play it safe and not ever say it. It's too holy.
Right.
Isaiah says, I'm a man of unclean lips. I'm not worthy to speak the name of God. Okay, well, so that's why people use these circumlocutions, these pious ways of alluding to God without saying, and they still do. Some pious Hasidim refer to God as Hashem, the name. They mean God. Well, so, how at the trial scene, they ask him, are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed One? And Jesus answered, you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power. Well, both of them mean God, but they're avoiding even that word. Forget about Yahweh. Even God they wanted to stay away from. And so they're both being extra careful. Well, that's why in the Son of Man blasphemy statement, God is called the Holy Spirit, the divine spirit, not a third person of the Trinity. They haven't gotten to that yet. But if you blaspheme the divine spirit, you're in a heck of a pit of trouble, my friend. And why were they doing that? Because they said, this Jesus, he's just a cheap carnival charlatan. He's casting out demons because he's in league with the devil. And Jesus says, have a care, my friend. You are attributing the work of God to the prince of demons. I'd watch out if I were you. That's blasphemy. And so it's just about blasphemy, as we would say. It takes a while to explain it, but it makes perfect sense to me, and it resolves this impossible puzzle that we get into because of the wording.
Well, thank you, Blake, for that super chat. I appreciate it. John Macker, thank you for the super chat. I'm reading a history of patristics and came across a certain Theophilus of Antioch. Spitballing here. But is there a connection to beginning of Luke?
Yeah, I think that's the one Luke wrote this for. It's not just my theory either. I first heard it from Stephen Huller, but also, I can't think of the guy's name, but some scholar from the early 20th century or maybe the late 19th already said this, that he thought since Luke is later than most people think, trying to shove it as far back into history as possible so it can be an eyewitness account, that since it's from the 2nd century, and if Polycarp wrote Luke or expanded the Marcionite gospel into Luke, he was a correspondent of Bishop Theophilus of Antioch. What does he say? I know there have been several accounts of Jesus already, but I'm going to provide you with the definitive version so you can know the real truth of the matter. Well, it's not like he's preaching to some heathen. let me share the gospel with you, friend. No, he says, I want you to get the facts straight because I have researched them and here's the way it was. To his brother bishop. So I think that's who it was, and that's who Luke is talking about, or Luke, quote unquote.
Great question, great comment, great answer. Thank you for that. Rex Profanus, Christianity is like wrestling. The story is a work, but the fans' love is a shoot. I think they call them marks in the biz. Long live Bob.
Huh. You mean they're being taken in like the audience in professional wrestling?
I would say so, yeah.
Yeah, I don't know that there's malicious intent. I mean, you can find charlatan evangelists and healers by the bushel, but I don't think the whole thing is just like an attempt to rip off the gullible sheep. There are too many serious people who are doing really good things in the name of their faith, and I don't see any reason to think the founders of it were any different. I mean, they could have been charlatans, but why think so? I don't see any particular reason to. I think they're wrong in their assertions. They really have no basis for the things they say about the historical Jesus or about heaven and hell. Like I constantly bore Carol when we're watching TV and one of these ads comes on with Franklin Graham or one or two other evangelists that have commercials. I say, friend, you can know if you're going to heaven or not. Are you alone and lonesome? Well, you got to have a friend in God's Son, Jesus, and you can know you're going to heaven. And I think, how on earth can they possibly think they know this? Of course, they were just raised believing in it, and they believe it ultimately because some old book said to, because some adult told them to, but they have no way to justify that. It's sheer surmise. So I think people are fooling themselves, but I don't think they're marks or gullible chumps necessarily.
Well, thank you for that super chat. And the next one is from Constellation Pegasus. Again, Constellation Pegasus, thank you so much for everything you do, for supporting me in this channel. I really appreciate it. You always have good questions too. Why was the Book of Enoch written? There's a lot of stuff in there that goes against what Jews believe. And was it an ancient science fiction novel? That book is way lit there.
There are 5 different books. First Enoch is actually a Pentateuch. 5 books have just been sort of stuck together, just like the Book of Psalms is 5 shorter psalm collections crammed together, and the Book of Proverbs is 7 collections of Proverbs joined together. So that's what they did here, and they are rather different. And one big hunk of it is speculative astronomy. When the ancient sages talked about wisdom, they meant a lot of things, including natural philosophy, that is speculative natural science. In other words, trying to figure out how the world got here, like the Ionian Greek scientists, Thales and Anaximander. In fact, Genesis 1 sounds very much like that. So that was already a product of the same instinct. Well, in Enoch and various other ancient apocalypses, what you have is the sage who wrote it speculating on how it's set up there. I mean, where does it rain from? Why does it snow sometimes? Where are the stars? Are they in a repository? Are they in a big hangar? Is there a storehouse of rain that is, they turn on the faucet, so to speak, occasionally? Is there a a storehouse of snowflakes? As this may sound silly to us, but of course they had no telescopes or anything. And so they're trying to say, well, I bet there's a section devoted to that here and another one devoted to this. The lightning is probably stored up there and so on. And then where do the dead go before the resurrection at the end of time? Well, I bet there's some sort of holding place for them. They're not suffering, but they're not enjoying the full presence of God. Let's call it Abraham's bosom, and so on and so on. And maybe there's a worse place under the earth, like the Greeks say. Nobody's tunneled down there yet, but it would make sense. I mean, look at the volcanoes and stuff. Maybe there's a fiery realm where the damned go. So they were just trying to think it out based on what they could see. And because they were interested in that. Is there a particular religious value to that? No, they just had interests that were scientific and came up with these theories. Some of them were allegories of biblical history. In the form, like different kings would be rams and their subjects would be sheep, and the bad kings would lead the sheep to destruction and so forth. And they would allegorize different periods of Israelite history this way and leave it up to you to puzzle out what was going on. There were visions of heaven and the different angels, the different levels of heaven and the different angel species that inhabited them. And Enoch eventually sees the very throne of God, and he sees one like a son of man who was of course, featured in Daniel chapter 7, which is probably more or less contemporary with First Enoch. And Enoch says, who is this? And he's finally told the big secret: you are the Son of Man who is born unto righteousness.
Wow.
Go ahead.
No, I should have said, wow, that's fascinating.
Oh, it's so great. And so they're like 5 different books of Enoch. And then there is the Secrets of Enoch, Second Enoch, which is probably a little later. And then there is Third Enoch, which comes from like the 5th century, and maybe the most interesting of all, because it's got Enoch becoming the lesser Yahweh. And oh man, my gosh, these things all were like the Dead Sea Scrolls sect. Whoever they were, early Christians, Essenes, who knows, they loved this stuff and had copies of it among the Dead Sea Scrolls. Unlike the Pharisees, who were like Protestants, we got a shorter canon and we're keeping it that way. Keep all this wacky stuff you've had visions of to yourselves, won't you? And early Christians were much influenced by this stuff. The Epistle of Jude even quotes First Enoch verbatim, as I'm sure you know. And so it was a type of Judaism that survived by trickling like an underground stream and bursting forth again in the form of the Kabbalah, which is certainly still with us.
Yeah,
great stuff.
Yeah, you can definitely see the Enochian tradition influencing Christianity. Really obvious. And not even mentioned, you got the Jude is quoting from Enoch. But thank you for that, Constellation Pegasus. You always have good questions, and thank you. Judge Lot, thank you for the super chat. Dr. Bob, who is your favorite Superman copycat character? Any publication or company? Mine is J. Michael Straczynski's version of Hyperion.
Yeah, he's good. I'm tempted to say Captain Marvel, the original one, Billy Batson. And I'm tempted to say the Sentry, a recent character from Marvel, but I think I would have to say that it's Supreme, a Rob Liefeld creation, who is like Superman with an attitude. Superman is very humble and modest. Supreme is hypertext on Superman. Suppose he had the arrogance you might have if you were all powerful. Would you have the patience to imprison and rehabilitate criminals, or would you just destroy them? And I just love this. He's like the Punisher with the powers of Superman. So I guess Supreme would be my favorite next to Superman.
Wow, thank you for that. That's a good question. Serious Eye, thank you for the super chat. I've heard you describe the Pharisee as Zoroastrian Jews. To what extent would you say Persian Iranian thought influences the Abrahamic tradition, Judaism, Christianity, Islam as we know it?
Almost completely. I would go so far as to say that if there'd never been any Zoroastrianism, you would have something like the ancient Israelite religion, or at least you might, but you wouldn't have Judaism as we know it, and there would be no Christianity or Islam. How come? Well, it appears that when Cyrus, the Persian emperor, took over the Babylonian Empire and sent back Zerubbabel and then Ezra and Nehemiah to restart Judaism and to bring the law, like it says that Ezra, an operative of the Persian emperor, though also a Jew, he came back with the law of God in his hand, and he read it all to the crowds, and they said, "Okay, we'll go along with it." It's no coincidence that starting from the Persian period, you suddenly have attested in Judaism ideas such as Satan as the evil anti-God, which he had not been before. He had been God's servant, his officer in charge of sting operations. Let's see if Job is really as loyal as he's cracked up to be, or David. Does he really trust God? Let's find out, because we don't want God to be mocked. Well, now he's the evil opponent of God. Where'd that come from? Well, he's been remodeled after the image of Ehrman, the evil anti-god of Zoroastrianism. Before the exile and the Persians, you didn't have resurrection of the dead in the Old Testament. But as of that period and on into Alexander's time, you've got resurrection of the dead in Daniel and Ezekiel and a late part of Isaiah. And of course, in the New Testament, it's big. And it became real big among the Pharisees, as did the Satan thing. Also, the idea of a foreordained dispensational progress of the ages, that it was all mapped out historically, that there would be a cosmic battle back and forth between God and Satan, between Ahura Mazda and Ahriman, and ultimately God would emerge from emerge as the winner, and he would send the Saoshyans, a messianic benefactor, which is what that means, who would be a virginally conceived descendant of the prophet Zoroaster. And he would raise all the dead to face the judgment at the final assize. Guardian angels, like when Peter narrowly escapes being beheaded by Herod Agrippa, and shows up at his disciples' house while they're praying for him. He said, "It's me, I escaped." That can't be. It must be his angel. In other words, they thought they were too late. He was dead, and this was his spirit double, his guardian angel, saying farewell. That comes right out of Zoroastrianism, too. And so much of this, it didn't appear in Judaism before the Persian Empire, and it blossoms forth suddenly after that. And what does Pharisee mean? Well, they began to say it was derived from the Hebrew word for separatists, perushim, but that seems to be a pun. It's more likely it means Parsi, Persian. In India today, Zoroastrians are called Parsis because they immigrated from Iran or Persia. And the Sadducees weren't some kind of modern rationalist unbelievers. They were the old-time fundamentalists. And they said to the Pharisees, "Where are you getting this stuff? I never heard of this. What is resurrection of the dead? Come on, when you die, you're dead. you better hope for a good reputation. That's all you're going to get. Or all these angels? What are you talking about? Are you hallucinating? And Ahriman and the Messiah, virgin. What the heck is this? You're not really Jews anymore. You're Parsis. You're Zoroastrians. Some rabbis thought that Baruch, the secretary of Jeremiah, was Zoroaster, and so on and so on. So it seems to me that with the apocalyptic stuff and the messianic stuff, if Zoroastrianism hadn't introduced that to Judaism, we would not have Judaism as we know it, and we would not have Christianity or Islam in any form.
Wow, that was great. Thank you for that. That was a great answer. Constellation Pegasus with another, and thank you. I don't know how else more I can say, but thank you. Jehovah's Witness admits nobody was looking for Jesus when he was expected to appear on the scene. Were the Jews or anyone expecting him to show up at a certain time?
Well, a lot of them were, as you can tell from works like the Psalms of Solomon and some of the Dead Sea Scrolls. And one big reason for that is the way Daniel was being interpreted. Jeremiah had predicted, or at least in the book of Jeremiah, it predicts that the Babylonian exile would last for 70 years. And as it turned out, it only lasted about 50. And even then, most Jews didn't go back because they weren't persecuted there. They got along fine. But but whoever wrote Daniel he knew there was a problem there with a gap. And he said, well, I bet the author of Daniel really meant 70 sevens of years, or 70 weeks of years, 490 years, starting from the order of Cyrus to rebuild the temple. And actually, there were 3 possible dates for that, so nobody was exactly sure when it had transpired, but they did have a basic idea. It must be getting close now if Daniel was right. And so many did expect that the Messiah would soon come, or he might actually be here already. I love this. They said the Messiah is here, but he is languishing, sitting outside, his back against the city wall of Rome as a leper and a beggar, and he's waiting to throw off the disguise and deliver Israel. Why is he waiting? Because we haven't proven ourselves worthy yet. Once we do, okay, let's go. Let's roll. So for God's sake, everybody repent. And that would have been enough to tip off John the Baptist or any number of other ones to say, look, it can't be long now. You're going to face the judgment. You better get cleaned up.
Yeah, interesting. And I know a lot of Christians throw out that number 444, and they literally don't get it from anywhere in the text. It's like they just, in hindsight, apply it to the text to make it fit the number somehow. I need to have it in front of me right now. I'm kind of like just throwing off the top of my head. But I do know for a fact that Christians will claim that there's the exact amount of years were predicted by Daniel, from Daniel to the time of 70. He predicts it spot on, and Messiah or something like that, 70 years or whatever. But the truth of the matter is that there is no indicator of Daniel doing that. And they kind of apply the numbers to Daniel themselves after the fact, but it's not in Daniel. So I just wanted to throw that out there too. So, but it is interesting.
Yeah, that's why they keep missing the boat, right?
Yeah.
In every generation, probably every year, some group is saying, okay, this is it. We got it this time. Obviously, if it were that clear cut, they wouldn't have to keep. I mean, of course, they could get a true prediction. They could capture the intent of a biblical author, and it just fell through. But you would think they're not going to admit that. So you'd think they would say, oh, okay, we can't know. I guess Jesus was right. No one knows the day or the hour.
And it's like how Revelation says after 1,000 years, the devil will be released and go out. And after, there'll be the reign is over and the end of the world is going to come. Well, that caused Pope Sylvester in the year 1000 to come out and announce, this is it, guys, get ready. You have less than 30 years left. And of course that didn't happen. So people just kind of sweep that under the rug like it didn't happen. And the Protestants will say, that's the Catholic Church. Of course they're wrong. But it's like, no, that's your Bible, though. It's your Bible, not the Catholic Church, your Bible. So it's like, I don't know, man. But
and when it happens, it's like in Festinger and his colleague's book, When Prophecy Failed. You know what's going to happen in the worst case scenario when the date falls through. People may kill themselves. I remember once I was driving from New Jersey into New York City, and along the shoulder of Route 3, there was this Korean guy holding up a placard saying the world will end on October so-and-so. I thought, oh boy, another one. Well, it didn't happen. And I read in the news that a bunch of them could not live with it and kill themselves. Well, usually they don't do that. They just reinterpret it. They say, oh, well, it happened, but it's like Bill Clinton's theology. It depends on what the meaning of the word is. Was it really predicting Jesus would come to the earth, or did he just enter the heavenly tabernacle? Yeah, that's the ticket. Or he is reigning, but invisibly from heaven. Yeah, that's it. And they just can't. It's cognitive dissonance. That's what led to the whole theory of cognitive dissonance.
Yeah, it's really, but it's the biggest example, the most apparent example of cognitive dissonance is fundamentalist Christians.
Yes,
it seriously is. It literally.
Yes,
it's the best way to look at cognitive dissonance. Just go find your online fundamentalist young earth creationist friend. Just talk to them. It's just sorry, but it's true. But
no exaggeration.
Yeah. Gray's 174 with another one. I think we have a couple more left. We're almost getting there. How much would you have to adjust your worldview if we found a copy of Daniel definitely dated to before all those prophecies?
Well, I would be happy to say, I guess, well, I'd say we have to find some way of explaining what appear to be anachronisms. We have to re-examine the evolution.
There'd be a lot of explanations needed if that was the case.
You would have to take the allegorical description of what seems to fit the Hasmonean struggle real well and show what else it's referring to. So, you could go back to the drawing board, and I guess you'd have to, but that's why critics think that's never going to be a problem. I mean, if you can't use the considerations that led to a 2nd century BCE date to Daniel, you can't date anything. It's an especially clear case.
Yeah, and then you have to explain why are all these Hellenistic idioms in this text before the Hellenistic age. There's just so much you'd have to explain. But it would be, I don't know. I guess I have to, for me to adjust my worldview. It's hard to explain if I would or not, and I guess I would have to wait to see if it happened. You know what I mean? Like I can't say if I would adjust my worldview, unless it happened. Maybe I would understand it then. But it's just it's such an obscure thing. You know what I mean?
Well, an interesting parallel might be, what do you make of Nostradamus? Because there were things people plausibly understand as predictions, that there's going to be this evil dictator named Hister who's going to do this and that.
Is that what it says? Wow.
Yeah. And there's something about a Napoleon. And was the guy clairvoyant? It does make you wonder about that. And the scientific attitude is to keep an open mind on it. But I don't think the mere possibility that it was fulfilled prophecy or parapsychological clairvoyance, like there's good reason to believe that Swedenborg actually had clairvoyant visions in the presence of other people. And it turns out he was right. He said, There's a factory in so and so town, long distance from here. There's a fire in it. Well, it turned out they dispatched messages, and son of a gun, there was. He couldn't have known that. I mean, I don't know how to explain that. There are weird things that happen, but guesswork isn't proof. I mean, who knows what? Certain things as yet have to remain puzzles. It doesn't mean the first thing anybody cooks up is necessarily the answer to it.
Yeah, and I know a lot of the Nostradamus stuff. It's very like vague. Like,
Yeah,
the bird will fly into a tree. I'm like, oh, that's an airplane going into a building. Like, you can interpret it how, especially when you're looking back at history, you can reinterpret things the way whatever that sounds the most like, just attach it to that, and then there you go. But I'm also not closed off to it. You never know. Anything's possible. Judge Lott, Dr. Bob, I grew up Southern Baptist. My church was under the SB convention. Are SBs Arminian in their theology? And what are Reformed Southern Baptists? Thank you, sir.
As I understand it, Baptists tend to have a kind of half Calvinist view. They may speak in terms of predestination, but they define it as foreknowledge, as if there's a difference, because there's a big question there is, if God knows what the future is, how is it not predetermined? Does he have to will it to happen like a guy writing a novel? Who knows? But they'll say, like I've heard my old Baptist pastor would say, it's like it's like you could take a train to this or that destination. Once you climb aboard either train, you are predestined, quote unquote, to get to that destination. Even if you hopped on the wrong one, well, tough luck, because you're headed there. And he says it was your choice. So free will and the predestination, that's sort of a tautology, though. That's the big problem with that, that you may not be able to back out of it, but I don't know that really amounts to any sort of predestination. Maybe it does, who knows? But they'll say it is really up to you to choose Christ and grace and salvation. So that seems to be Arminian. But once you do it, if you really do it, you are eternally secure. There's nothing you can do to revoke your membership in the elect. You could become a child molester. You could be a murderer like this guy in Idaho and be unrepentant about it. Well, you're going to heaven. You've got the ticket, and they won't make you give it back, though. When you get to heaven, you're going to have a lot of weeping and repenting to do, but Peter did, and so that's what will happen. So they don't believe in perseverance of the saints, that if you're genuinely saved, you won't ever fall into serious sin again. If you do, it just shows you were fake. You thought you were saved, but like our Puritan friends, like you were wrong. And so Baptists are kind of half Calvinists, though there are also Reformed Baptist congregations who are small, very Calvinist denomination, where they have they're tiptoeing through the tulip, total depravity, unconditional election, limited atonement, irresistible grace, and perseverance of the saints, the whole 9 yards. But they're Baptists. They don't believe in covenant theology, so they don't baptize infants. But as to Calvinism, the central doctrine, they do believe in it. And some Southern Baptists, I think, do too, because though they're becoming totalitarian and dogmatic, telling people what they have to believe, historically, the Southern Baptists claimed they taught freedom of conscience in interpreting scripture. And so there was an allowable diversity, but they've become more lockstep in the last couple of decades because they're afraid the denomination is going to become liberal and modernist.
Wow, thank you for that. That was a good answer. Appreciate that. Constellation Pegasus with another. Was Jesus crucified in 33? Or is that just the date the church made up, like 6,000-year-old Earth?
Yeah, it was. I mean, like the 6,000 years that Bishop Ussher came up with, it is based on data in the Bible. Ussher calculated based on the genealogies of the Old Testament figures. There's enough of them that they overlap, and they're specific enough. It'll say like Noah was so and so years old when he begat Shem, and then he lived for this many more years and died. Meanwhile, Shem lived this amount till he begat so and so, and you can do those wall to wall, and you come up with something like 4004 BCE, and so now that would be 6,000 plus. Well, the thing with Jesus, it's simpler. Because what they do is to take what Luke said, that when Jesus was baptized by John, entering into his public ministry, he was about 30. And then in John's gospel, Jesus is present at 3 different Passover feasts. And from that, they deduce that he had a ministry of 3 years. Though that really doesn't work because that's all theological symbolism. The evangelist has Jesus. He wants Jesus to say certain Passover-related things 3 times. He has 3 things for him to say, so he has to have him at 3 Passovers. But it's not like he definitely had any information. But that's where they get the 30 plus 3 years. Irenaeus believed that Jesus died when he was about 50. And the reason for that is that in John's gospel, he says, when he does the temple cleansing, he says, tear down this temple and in 3 days I'll build another. And they didn't realize he was speaking about the temple of his body. Well, then they retort, but it's taken 46 years to build this temple. It isn't even finished yet. You're going to build it in 3 days? Crazy. And then there's another one where Jesus says, Abraham saw my day coming, and he was glad. And they said, Abraham saw you? You're not even 50 years old. Well, why not say, if Jesus is 33 at that point, why not say you're not 40. Even 40?
Right.
And so Alfred Loisy figured that Irenaeus figured that, okay, at the time he had that exchange with the Pharisees, he must have been 46 because that matches how long it took the temple to get to this state. And then it happens at the beginning of the Gospel of John. So if there are 3 Passovers, you add 3 more years, and Jesus would have died at age 49. And that would be not yet 50. And I bet he was right. I bet that is what Irenaeus, how he came up with it. And Irenaeus said, well, everybody back in the Eastern churches knows this, though he's the only one we ever hear it from. And of course, he did think Jesus was crucified. I once read somebody saying that, he thought Jesus died in bed of old age because he died at nearly 50. No, you got to read the whole thing. He thought he was, Irenaeus thought Jesus was crucified at age 49. But who knows? I mean, there were some Christians that thought he was born 100 years BCE.
Right.
That's one argument for mythicism. You mean they couldn't keep that straight with a historical figure of recent history?
The Talmud has this Alexander Jannaeus.
Yeah.
That's 83 BC. That's the time of Sulla. That's before Caesar was even Like, that's going back, man. Like, yeah, my response to that is always, I don't know what that means. Like, it's weird.
Yeah, we don't really, but
Yeah, it's very strange. It's very strange. But thank you for that consolation package. Says, and he's one more. Last one. Why would the book of Job be the first inspired book? A lot of nasty stuff God allowed to happen to that man. Hard to believe the creator of the universe would allow events to happen.
Well, the book of Job has apparently 3 components to it. There's the prose version, which is the first chapters before it starts getting into poetry, and then gives us a sort of a Greek drama with the different actors saying different poetic speeches. But the opening part in prose, where God is meeting with the sons of God and the Satan is there, and they make the bet, okay, we'll find out if Job really means this stuff. And then at the very end, where something is missing, but most of it's there, because at the end, God appears in a cyclone and says, the rest of you guys better shut up. Job's the only one of you that has spoken rightly of me. And so all the stuff that the Satan took away from Job, God restores. That part is fairly simple and it's straightforward. This bet with Satan was to see how much Job could endure and yet remain faithful to God. And he did. But then there's the central part, the longest part, which I maintain is the great masterpiece of the Bible, where all this, it's presupposed that all these horrors have happened to Job, though it doesn't get all that specific in this part. And he's saying, his 3 friends come to comfort him and say, well, Job, let's face it, you must have committed some awful sin. God would never be unfair and let this stuff happen to you if you didn't do something to deserve it. And Job says, look, if I had done something, I would be the first to admit it, but I have not. And then he goes on and says, if only I could take God before a judge and make my case, I would be vindicated. But of course, I can't do that because I can't find him. But he can spot me because everywhere I go, he's firing arrows into me. And so he is really steamed at God. And when Eliphaz and the other guys start countering this, he lays them low again with another sarcastic, poetic reply. And then the third section of Job, they've sandwiched in a 4th critic of Job, Elihu, I think his name is. And they all have different theories as to why the innocent suffer. Elihu says it's educative. These things are happening to teach you, kind of like Stoicism. The others have slightly different versions. And the point seems to be to counter traditional Jewish wisdom, because Job is saying, you can say nice guys finish first. Honesty is the best policy. God will take care of you if you're good. But obviously that is wrong, or this wouldn't be happening to me. I don't know why God does this to me. And at the end, God says, listen, Mr. Smart Guy, tell me this. Do you know what makes the birds migrate? Do you know what holds the Pleiades together in their constellation? Do you know why animals behave by instinct? And one natural phenomena after another, and Job's reaction is pretty much, he says, well, I've always heard about you, but now I see you and I recoil in shame. And what is God's answer? It's, sorry, buddy. There is no answer. You think you can hold me accountable? I'm God. I created this stuff. You can't explain a bit of it. What makes you think you can understand my ways? Oh, and that seems to be the point of the book, what Schleiermacher called agnostic pietism. If I can just say one last thing. A modern version of this is a play by Elie Wiesel called The Trial. and it's based on something he actually saw as a boy in Auschwitz. A bunch of guys in one of these awful barracks who were rabbis got together and decided, I don't know how we got here. We're being faithful to God, but we're the ones being tormented. Why is he doing it? Let's put God on trial, just like Job said he wanted to. And he says, let's try God for crimes against humanity. And suddenly Satan shows up and volunteers to be God's defender. And it goes on, and they convict God of crimes against humanity. And then they say, well, now that's over. It's time to pray.
Wow.
Though he slay me, yet will I trust him. That's the point of Job. Who can know why this happens? This can't prove or disprove God, but do we experience God? And that's the Jewish answer.
Mm-hmm. Sure. That was great. Rex Profanus says the Flavian heaven was like Christian heaven that you got in by being good. The Flavians used to have a temple where worship took place, not at the Flavian Caesar palace. The heaven was similar to Christians.
Wow. Fascinating.
I'm definitely going to look into that. It's interesting stuff.
Yeah.
And the next one is from Myth Vision Podcast. Derek Lambert says, I love and miss you, Dr. Price.
Yeah, likewise. There is a remedy to that. But that's not up to me. It's a divine mystery. But that's right.
The mystery will be unraveled one day. But yeah.
I think Derek is great and Myth Vision is great. I've always said that, even in the thick of our past troubles.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you, Derek, for that. Appreciate that. Well, there's a few more. We'll just get through them, and there's a lot. I don't know. I wasn't expecting all these super chats, so everybody.
That's my job.
Yeah, that's why I'm gonna have to drop you a PayPal if this is over. So I will. Vaguely agnostic. Thank you for the 666. So glad to see Dr. Price. His passion for knowledge of history makes it come alive for all of us. Thanks, Neil. Thank you for watching. Vaguely agnostic. I always like Vaguely agnostic has always been around since I started this channel. So it's always good to see certain people that you have been watching since my channel had less than 1,000 subscribers. So that's one of those. Thank you for that. I appreciate it. Safra Brico, thank you for the supers. How did Eve sin before she had knowledge of good and evil? Wow. How would she know that she should follow God's instruction?
Yeah. My daughter, Victoria, was supposed to do some little cartoon story thing about a Bible story in elementary school. And so she did the real story of the Garden of Eden. And when God shows up to rebuke and condemn Adam and Eve, Eve says, wait a minute, this is unfair. How are we supposed to know not to do this when what we didn't know was the difference between good and evil? I thought, now that I raised that kid right. But yeah, how does she know? Well, I think the answer to this is that it's being read in the wrong conceptual framework. Historically, Jews have traced evil to a different part of Genesis, the fall of the sons of God, because they originally, that little story in Genesis 6, 1-4, sons of God looked on the daughters of men and saw that they said hubba hubba and cohabited with them, and the result was the Nephilim, the giants in the earth, the great men of renown, and then it starts out with the earth grew wicked. The imagination of mankind was evil every day, all day, and God said, "Oh man, what a mistake I made creating these vermin. Well, it's not too late. I'm drowning them all like the rats they are." And then, because this is mythology, poor Calvin and others are trying to explain, well, he didn't actually regret what he had done. It was just as if, get out of here. That was the origin of evil, the contamination of we would say, the genetic pool or whatever by the admixture of the genes of the fallen angels. Now, originally, there was no condemnation attached to that. It was just an ethnic myth trying to explain why the Anakim were so tall. I must have some divine blood in there somewhere. But the way the editor of Genesis has placed it, it was a bad idea. And that's when the human race fell into sin, having been genetically, basically, corrupted. And so that's the fall. What about Eden? Well, if you look close at that, there's nothing said about them becoming evil. Rather, you get the impression, I do, and the ancient Gnostics did, talk about Gnostic information. They said, like the Nag Hammadi texts, that God and his fellow deities were the ones who went romping in the garden. It was their oasis and pleasure garden, like the king of Babylon had. And why did he create the man? This is just chapters 2 and 3, the J account of creation. Well, he needed a caretaker to trim and prune and all that stuff. And so he made the man, which is just why the human race was created in the Enuma Elish. They needed a race of slaves for the gods, but Yahweh needed only one. And after a while, he noticed that the man was lonesome because there was no real work involved. And he said, I think I'll take pity on him and make an appropriate companion for him. Well, he made the man, the Adam, out of the ground. And he said, well, let me try again. And he conjures up something from the ground, and it's an animal. It's no good. He tries another one. It's a different animal, but still nothing. And all the animal species follow the man's creation. And he has to keep trying because none of them are an adequate friend, no doubt because they can't speak. I'm sure that's the point of it. God says, well, maybe I'll have better luck if I make another one out of the ground like I did the man. No, I mean, if I don't do that, every time I try that, it comes out different. Let me do something different. I will take a piece of the man and fashion it into another one of those. And so he does, and that's Eve. And when the Adam sees her, he says, at last, this is flesh of my flesh, bone of my bone, unlike Cheetah and Fido over here. And so what does he tell him? God says, well, you can eat of any of this luscious fruit from any of these trees, even the tree of life, but keep your mitts off of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, because the day you eat it, you will drop dead. I don't think you want that. It's poison. Okay, fair enough. Well, he leaves, and the serpent comes up to the first couple and say, oh, here God said you could avail yourself of any of this fruit from any of these trees, right? And Eve says, well, almost, but we're to steer clear of this one because apparently it's poison. It would be fatal to eat that. And the serpent says, he told you that? Believe me, that is not what would happen. If you eat of it, your eyes will be opened and you will be like gods, knowing good and evil. And it says, when the woman saw that, contrary to what she had thought, it was good for food, not poison, and that it was desirable to make one wise. Well, she took and ate of it and gave some to her husband with her. Now, God gets mad. The next day, he's out for his evening constitutional, which he always spends chatting with the man and the woman. He's like, well, where is everybody? Over here. What are you doing in the bushes? He says, well, we suddenly realized we were naked and felt embarrassed. Oh, well, Wait a second. Did you eat from the tree I told you not to eat from? And again, to quote the Bible, Adam says, it was the woman's fault. You gave her to me, and she gave it to me, and I ate. And, oh, really? So it's your fault, lady? And she says, it was the snake. The snake is the one that tricked me into it. Well, I see you're all guilty. And he hands out the punishments. The man has to farm the ground with difficulty. It's not going to be easy to pick the fruit anymore. He's got to plow and all that stuff. In the sweat of your brow, you will bring forth food. And the woman, keep in mind, the punishment fits the crime. So he says, let's see, you will have pain in childbirth. And you might want to avoid that by locking the bedroom door on your husband, but it's not going to work because your desire will be for him and he will rule over you. It's this typical domestic servitude hierarchy, right? And then the snake, well, you better watch out for hoes and pitchforks because the humans are going to be after you from now on. What is it they did wrong? Well, they disobeyed God, but it's not a sin because who was lying in that story? It's not the serpent. What the serpent said would happen does happen, and we know that because the narrator says it, and God says it. Yeah, they didn't die, and their eyes were opened, and now they're like God. So what was the knowledge? Well, it was carnal knowledge. It was knowledge of procreation. He didn't want them to be fruitful and multiply. That's the other guy's creation story. He doesn't want them to multiply because he only wanted one originally. Two was an afterthought. He doesn't want the whole stinking planet overrun with a race of people who are like gods and will never die. That's going to mean his deity pantheon is going to be lost. They'll be overrun in a world full of gods. So he says to the other gods, let's get them the heck out of here before they think to eat from the tree of life and live forever. So it's sex. It's procreation. It's not that sex is supposed to be dirty. It's sort of antinatalism, as we now say. He didn't want a whole human race, but now he's stuck with it, but at least they won't live forever. Now, is this arbitrary? I don't think so, because it's so much like the Gilgamesh epic, where the goddess Oruru, spurned by the demigod Gilgamesh, tries to get revenge on him by creating a man from the dust of the ground. Enkidu, who's a great titan and lives like Tarzan with the animals. He steals game from the hunters' traps and so forth. And so the hunters go to Gilgamesh and say, somebody's stealing all of our game. Can you do something to stop this? And so he decides to fight Enkidu. Well, meantime, Oruru, the goddess, sends one of her temple prostitutes, or as I like to call them, priestitutes, to Enkidu to initiate him into sex. And they go at it for several days straight. And then to get washed off, Enkidu takes her to the watering hole where he meets his old animal buddies. But as soon as they see him, they run for the hills. He says, what the heck? What happened here? And she says, behold, Enkidu, you are become wise like a god. So sex was the threshold of divine wisdom because you become a creator too. And then they do fight, but they become buddies all that. I mean, that is so close in terms of elements of the story. And what the crucial thing is, wisdom has to do with discovering sex.
Wow. That is just profound. I wish we can dig more into that. Maybe I can have you back on and talk about for a whole episode on that topic. That is a fascinating topic right there. Thank you for that super chat. There's 3 more we got to get to, and then that's it. So let's try to thank you for so far for everything. And all these answers have been great, Dr. Rob. Thank you for that. I appreciate that. John Macker. So are you suggesting Polycarp write like.
Or wrote Luke, do you mean?
Oh, okay. I'm sorry.
What you said is actually what it says, but I bet you that's what he meant.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that Polycarp took the Marcionite gospel, which seems to have been an earlier, shorter version of either Luke or Mark, and Polycarp added quite a bit of material to draw it closer to the Old Testament, which Marcion severed. He repudiated it. He said, that's a Jewish scripture. It's not a Christian scripture. Let's not steal it from them. Let's have our own. And so he wrote, or he based his gospel on the shorter one. Let's see. Yeah. And so Polycarp, who we know was the arch enemy of Marcion and met him in Rome. And Marcion, who was trying to get appointed bishop of the Roman Church, saw him at a public bathhouse, I think, and said, hey, you recognize me? And he says, oh, yeah, I know the son of the devil when I see him. Now, I'm going to get out of here before this place collapses on me because you're in here. He hated Marcion and Marcionism. It appears, for various reasons I won't bore you into a coma with, it seems like he was the guy that first in like the early in the 2nd century actually came up with a 27 book list of the New Testament, which only 200 years later was canonized by Bishop Athanasius. And then it took more decades anyway for everybody to accept that. Well, but he started by padding out Luke to make it more Catholic-like. Then if C.C. Torrey was correct, and I find this convincing, Polycarp took an Aramaic book about the apostles, which Torrey called First Acts. It was an Aramaic version of our Acts chapters 1 through 15. It ended with the apostolic decree. And then he translated that and then composed what Torrey called Second Acts, which centered on Paul. And that was to counterbalance Paul with the 12 and to give the 12 a bigger role against Marcion, right? Because he thought the 12 were ninnies and idiots. Paul was the only real apostle. So Polycarp adds First Acts and writes Second Acts. To make Paul sound more Catholic, he added 3 new Pauline epistles, 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus, which make him sound very different and more Catholic. And he interpolated passages into the other 10 that were credited to Paul, whoever actually wrote them. And so this was the Marcionite, the early Catholic New Testament. It was based on Marcion's New Testament, but with more stuff. The other epistles, which are relatively insubstantial, James, Hebrews, let's pretend it's Paul's, it might have been, what the heck. The other ones like James, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, which are actually anonymous. Jude, 1st and 2nd Peter. They're not much, but at least they're epistles that might be by other apostles, so we can give them some more airtime than Marcion did. And the Book of Revelation, which seems to be anti-Pauline, and that's his New Testament. So he did a lot with it. He edited and wrote good parts of and I think he also changed the text of Matthew, Mark, and John to some degree, adding like sacramental and apocalyptic material that wasn't in there originally. And again, there are good reasons for this, but I know everybody's dying of ennui and boredom at this point. But yeah, I think he was a major voice of the New Testament.
Wow, that's interesting stuff. But yeah, thank you for that answer. And like all these questions are all just great topics that we can talk about for hours and hours, you know. So
Mhm.
the next one is Renzo Rodriguez. Are the Gospels, especially Mark, original as literature?
Did they start out as literature, as fictions? Uh, that's uh, that's what I would take the question to mean. Some people think so. Like there's one theory that Mark was written um, in Rome as a play to honor one of the Flavian, what, the sister of the emperor, Julia Domna or something like that, who had become a Christian, as I say, and that she is the woman that anoints Jesus, was played by her, and it was dedicated to her. This is certainly speculative, but this scholar knows an awful lot about ancient theaters and performances, and she thinks that Mark is based on the script for a play and its
Wow.
stage directions. It's fascinating. There's a chapter in our book, Varieties of Jesus, Mythicism, about that. Let's see. Some people have thought that the first couple of chapters of Luke, the infancy narratives of John and Jesus, might have been a nativity play. Bishop Spong had that theory. And because the long canticles that the characters sing, it's like in a musical. You know, I feel a song coming on. The Magnificat and so forth. Some say the Book of Revelation was originally a play script. We don't really know, and I find it doubtful. But Bruno Bauer, one of the great 19th century radical critics, thought that Mark was completely fictional, and that what the evangelist Mark, or Seymour, or whatever his name actually was, that he got the idea, I think, from it was either Seneca or Cicero, I forget which, who said, you know, a good guide to a moral life would be to pick some heroic moral figure from history that you admire, and whenever you find yourself tempted to give up or to do something shady, imagine Hannibal or Julius Caesar or Diogenes standing beside you and saying, Price, do you really want to do that? I'd be pretty disappointed in you if you did. Yeah, darn it, I guess I won't. And that's what Mark did by creating Jesus. It's like the button people used to wear back in the 90s or so, WWJD, what would Jesus do? That was essentially the idea behind the Gospel of Mark. That Jesus was a fictional character, but it was like a couple of these questions about Superman. Unfortunately, Superman never existed, but he's such a moral paragon, you could actually use him the same way. What would the Man of Steel think if he saw me doing this? And so he thought, yeah, the whole thing was fictional. And I've come back to that largely because I'm convinced by Thomas Brodie and a bunch of other scholars that the Gospels are fictive rewrites of material from the Old Testament.
Wow, that was great. Thank you for that question. Thank you for that answer. And this is the final one of the night. Constellation Pegasus, of course, it has to end on you. Of course, wouldn't be right if it didn't. Rashi commentary says the serpent saw Adam and Eve having sex and got all jazzed up, wanting to break up the couple. Without that commentary, you can't know that is science fiction to me. You can't know that, period. That is science fiction to me. I didn't see the period. Sorry, that.
No, that is. Well, yeah, what that is, I think, is what's called what is it? An academic or a scholarly or scribal myth where somebody embellishes the story to try to explain the story. Like my favorite example is the story of Lilith. Who the heck was that? Well, in the rabbis didn't understand about source criticism. How could they? And so they noticed the contradictions between Genesis 1 and Genesis 2. The order of creation is different. In chapter 1, God or gods implicitly create Ha-Adam, mankind, male and female, all at the same time, and says, be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth. But he's already created all the animal species on the previous days, right? And there's nothing about a fall. So in chapter 2, he creates the one male, or an androgyne, that's possible. And then he creates all the animal species as an afterthought. And then as an afterthought, he either creates a female human or splits the androgyne in half, just like in Plato's Symposium. And he doesn't intend them to be fruitful and multiply, but they wind up discovering sex with the help of the serpent, and we've already seen what happened there. Well, there's some real contradictions there. And what did the rabbis do? They said, for one thing, I mean, just to focus on this one, how come there were men and women created at the same time, and apparently more of them, in chapter 1, but one man, then one woman in chapter 2? Well, maybe there's a missing piece. Maybe when he made Adam and whoever, Adam, his wife was Lilith, who they sort of grabbed from Middle Eastern mythology. She was Lilitu, who was the night hag, who was their explanation for SIDS, sudden infant death syndrome. They'd say this demon has sucked the breath out of newborns. And she was believed to haunt the ruins of ancient civilizations. Well, at first they got along okay, but Lilith couldn't stand being bossed around by Adam. He's always saying, Lilith, you can't go to the movies tonight just because I, the king of the castle, said so. And she's, okay, to hell with this. And she leaves him and shacks up with Samael or Satan and becomes a demoness. But what's Adam going to do now? Well, God makes a second one, a Stepford wife, as it were, Eve, who's not going to give him any flack. And so she's his second wife. And now we know where Lilith, who's mentioned over in Isaiah, came from. Like, is that in the Bible? Well, you got to connect some pretty distant dots to even suggest it, but that's what happens with these exegetical legends. If maybe this is what ties them together. And there are a bunch of things like that. Another favorite of mine is these two rabbis are arguing, gee, where we wear these yarmulkes, these skull caps. Why do we do that? It's not in the Bible, is it? And the other rabbi says, of course it's in the Bible. Take a look at Genesis chapter 12, verse 3. He says, okay. And he reads it and he says, and Abraham went out from there. Where's the yarmulkes? Would Abraham go out without his yarmulke?
Love it. I love it. That's great. Wow. What this was a great chat. It's almost 3 hours now.
Oh, and I sure time goes out the window. It's such fun.
Thank you, Constellation Pegasus, for everything you've been doing. Thank you, everyone else. Thank you, everyone in the chat in general who's watching. I've enjoyed myself. Hopefully you are too. Dr. Bob, anything else you want to discuss before we get out of here? I'm going to play that interview or that clip that I played in the beginning for people who weren't here for that.
Well, I'll just say I have a new book out called The Gospels Behind the Gospels, which has a very new and different theory about sources for the Gospels we have that had very different Christologies. And then I have another one that I'm submitting to publishers called Houses of the Holy, subtitled A Higher Critical Survey of the World Religions, where I discuss the history and theology of 12 big religions. It's going to be about 600 pages, I think.
Wow. That's going to be intense. I'll be looking out for that. Look, where can they find that? Amazon?
Yeah, I think they say it. The Gospels behind the Gospels may be out in February, but I think you can pre-order it.
Okay, there you go. Check that out. Check it out on Amazon. And right before we go, I'm just gonna play. This is, my opinion, this is the all-time highlight of Dr. Robert Price, shutting down the fundamentalists' worldview, and after that, you have just attained true gnosis.
What business do you have saying, yeah, it's got to be true, so I believe it to be true? That's just producing a fault line that is not only going to commit you to dishonesty in your historical work, and every book of apologetics shows that. Victor just gave these great examples. What more do you need, Craig? What more do you need, Gish or D'Souza? How many hundreds of times does this have to be disproven for you to stop using this? There's this this great quote. Tillich says, fundamentalism has demonic aspects in that it splits the conscience of its thoughtful adherents and forces them to repress knowledge of which they are secretly aware. So why is the fundamentalist and the apologist on the warpath? Well, it's against himself. The unbeliever that he goes on crusade against is